Philosophy of Mind. GWF Hegel Table of Contents. Philosophy of Mind, 1. GWF Hegel, 1. Introduction, 1. Section 1 Mind Subjective, 4. Subsection A Anthropology, the Soul, 4. Subsection B Phenomenology of Mind, Consciousness, 18. Subsection C Psychology, Mind, 24. Section 2, Mind Objective, 41. A Law, 1, 43. B the Morality of Conscience, 1, 45. C the Moral Life, or Social Ethics, 1. 48. Section 3, Absolute Mind, 1, 66. A Art, 67. B Revealed Religion, 1, 69. C Philosophy, 71. Philosophy of Mind. I Philosophy of Mind. GWF Hegel. Translated by William Wallace. This page copyright symbol 2001 Black Mask Online. http://www.blackmask.com. Introduction. Section 1 Mind Subjective. Subsection A Anthropology, the Soul. Subsection B Phenomenology of Mind, Consciousness. Subsection C Psychology, Mind. Section 2, Mind Objective. A Law, 1. B the Morality of Conscience, 1. C the Moral Life, or Social Ethics, 1. Section 3, Absolute Mind, 1. A Art. B Revealed Religion, 1. C Philosophy. Part 3 of the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. Introduction. 377 The knowledge of mind is the highest and hardest, just because it is the most concrete of sciences. The significance of that absolute commandment, know thyself, whether we look at it in itself or under the historical circumstances of its first utterance, is ought to promote mere self-knowledge in respect of the particular capacities, character, propensities, and foibles of the single self. The knowledge it commands means that of man's genuine reality of what is essentially and ultimately true, and real of mind as the true and essential being. Equally little is it the purport of mental philosophy to teach what is called knowledge of men, the knowledge whose aim is to detect the peculiarities, passions, and foibles of other men, and lay bare what are called the recesses of the human heart. Information of this kind is, for one thing, meaningless, unless on the assumption that we know the universal man as man, and that always must be, as mind. And for another, being only engaged with casual, insignificant, and untrue aspects of mental life, it fails to reach the underlying essence of them all, the mind itself. 378 Pneumatology, or, as it was also called, rational psychology, has been already alluded to in the introduction to the logic as an abstract and generalizing metaphysic of the subject. Empirical, or inductive psychology, on the other hand, deals with the concrete mind, and, after the revival of the sciences, when observation and experience had been made the distinctive methods for the study of concrete reality, such psychology was worked on the same lines as other sciences. In this way it came about that the metaphysical theory was kept outside the inductive science, and so prevented from getting any concrete embodiment or detail, whilst at the same time the inductive science clung to the conventional common sense metaphysics, with its analysis into forces, various activities, etc., and rejected any attempt at a speculative treatment. Philosophy of Mind 1. The books of Aristotle on the soul, along with his discussions on its special aspects and states, are for this reason still by far the most admirable, perhaps even the sole, work of philosophical value on this topic. The main aim of a philosophy of mind can only be to reintroduce unity of idea and principle into the theory of mind, and so reinterpret the lesson of those Aristotelian books. 379 Even our own sense of the mind's living unity naturally protests against any attempt to break it up into different faculties, forces, or, what comes to the same thing, activities, conceived as independent of each other. But the craving for a comprehension of the unity is still further stimulated, as we soon come across distinctions between mental freedom and mental determinism, antitheses between free psychic agency and the corporeity that lies external to it, whilst we equally note the intimate interdependence of the one upon the other. In modern times especially the phenomena of animal magnetism have given, even in experience, a lively and visible confirmation of the underlying unity of soul, and of the power of its ideality. Before these facts, the rigid distinctions of practical common sense are struck with confusion, and the necessity of a speculative examination with a view to the removal of difficulties is more directly forced upon the student. 380 The concrete nature of mind involves for the observer the peculiar difficulty that the several grades and special types which develop its intelligible unity in detail are not left standing as so many separate existences confronting its more advanced aspects. It is otherwise in external nature. Their matter and movement, for example, have a manifestation all their own. It is the solar system, and similarly the differentiae of sense perception have a sort of earlier existence in the properties of bodies, and still more independently in the four elements. The species and grades of mental evolution, on the contrary, lose their separate existence and become factors, states, and features in the higher grades of development. As a consequence of this, a lower and more abstract aspect of mind betrays the presence in it, even to experience, of a higher grade. Under the guise of sensation, for example, we may find the very highest mental life as its modification or its embodiment. And so sensation, which is but a mere form and vehicle, may to the superficial glance seem to be the proper seat and, as it were, the source of those moral and religious principles with which it is charged, and the moral and religious principles thus modified may seem to call for treatment as species of sensation. But at the same time, when lower grades of mental life are under examination, it becomes necessary, if we desire to point to actual cases of them in experience, to direct attention to more advanced grades for which they are mere forms. In this way subjects will be treated of by anticipation which properly belong to later stages of development. For example, in dealing with natural awaking from sleep we speak by anticipation of consciousness, or in dealing with mental derangement we must speak of intellect. What mind, or spirit, is. 381 From our point of view mind has for its presupposition nature, of which it is the truth, and for that reason its absolute prius. In this its truth nature is vanished, and mind has resulted as the idea entered on possession of itself. Here the subject and object of the idea are one, either is the intelligent unity, the notion. This identity is absolute negativity, for whereas in nature the intelligent unity has its objectivity perfect but externalized, this self-externalization has been nullified and the unity in that way been made one and the same with itself. Thus at the same time it is this identity only so far as it is a return out of nature. 382 For this reason the essential, but formally essential, feature of mind is liberty, i.e. it is the notion's absolute negativity or self-identity. Considered as this formal aspect, it may withdraw itself from everything external and from its own externality, its very existence. It can thus submit to infinite pain, the negation of its individual immediacy. In other words, it can keep itself affirmative in this negativity and possess its own identity. All this is possible so long as it is considered in its abstract self-contained universality. 383 This universality is also its determinate sphere of being. Having a being of its own, the universal is self-particularizing, whilst it still remains self-identical. Hence the special mode of mental being is manifestation. The spirit is not some one mode or meaning which finds utterance or externality only in a philosophy of mind. Philosophy of mind too form distinct from itself, it does not manifest or reveal something, but its very mode and meaning is this revelation. And thus in its mere possibility mind is at the same moment an infinite, absolute, actuality. 384 Revelation, taken to mean the revelation of the abstract idea, is an unmediated transition to nature, which comes to be As mind is free, its manifestation is to set forth nature as its world, but because it is reflection, it, in thus setting forth its world, at the same time presupposes the world as a nature independently existing. In the intellectual sphere, to reveal is thus to create a world as its being, a being in which the mind procures the affirmation and truth of its freedom. The Absolute is mind, spirit. This is the supreme definition of the Absolute. To find this definition and to grasp its meaning and burden was, we may say, the ultimate purpose of all education and all philosophy. It was the point to which turned the impulse of all religion and science, and it is this impulse that must explain the history of the world. The word mind, spirit, and some glimpse of its meaning was found at an early period, and the spirituality of God is the lesson of Christianity. It remains for philosophy in its own element of intelligible unity to get hold of what was thus given as a mental image, and what implicitly is the ultimate reality, and that problem is not genuinely, and by rational methods, solved so long as liberty and intelligible unity is not the theme and the soul of philosophy. Subdivision 385. The development of mind, spirit, is in 3 stages. 1. In the form of self-relation. Within it has the ideal totality of the idea, i.e. it has before it all that its notion contains. Its being is to be self-contained and free. This is mind subjective. 2. In the form of reality, realized, i.e. in a world produced and to be produced by it. In this world freedom presents itself under the shape of necessity. This is mind objective. 3. In that unity of mind as objectivity and of mind as ideality and concept, which essentially and actually is, and forever produces itself, mind in its absolute truth. This is mind absolute. 386. The 2 first parts of the doctrine of mind embrace the finite mind. Mind is the infinite idea, and finitude here means the disproportion between the concept and the reality, but with the qualification that it is a shadow cast by the mind's own light, a show or illusion which the mind implicitly imposes as a barrier to itself, in order, by its removal, actually to realize and become conscious of freedom as its very being, i.e. to be fully manifested. The several steps of this activity, on each of which, with their semblance of being, it is the function of the finite mind to linger, and through which it has to pass, are steps in its liberation. In the full truth of that liberation is given the identification of the 3 stages: finding a world presupposed before us, generating a world as our own creation, and gaining freedom from it and in it. To the infinite form of this truth the show purifies itself till it becomes a consciousness of it. A rigid application of the category of finitude by the abstract logician is chiefly seen in dealing with mind and reason. It is held not a mere matter of strict logic, but treated also as a moral and religious concern. To adhere to the point of view of finitude, and the wish to go further, is reckoned a mark of audacity, if not of insanity, of thought. Whereas in fact such a modesty of thought, as treats the finite as something altogether fixed and absolute, is the worst of virtues, and to stick to a post which has no sound ground in itself is the most unsound sort of theory. The category of finitude was at a much earlier period elucidated and explained. At its place in the logic, an elucidatee, on which, as in logic for the more specific though still simple thought forms of finitude, so in the rest of philosophy for the concrete forms, has merely to show that the finite is not, i.e. is not the truth, but merely a transition and an emergence to something higher. This finitude of the spheres so far examined is the dialectic that makes a thing have its cessation by another and in another. Philosophy of mind. Philosophy of mind 3. But spirit, the intelligent unity and the implicit eternal, is itself just the consummation of that internal act by which nullity is nullified and vanity is made vain. And so, the modesty alluded to is a retention of this vanity. The finite in opposition to the true, it is itself therefore vanity. In the course of the mind's development we shall see this vanity appear as wickedness at that turning point at which mind has reached its extreme immersion in its subjectivity and its most central contradiction. Section 1. Mind subjective. 387 Mind, on the ideal stage of its development, is mind as cognitive. Cognition, however, being taken here not as a merely logical category of the idea, 223, but in the sense appropriate to the concrete mind. Subjective mind is, a, immediate or implicit, a soul, the spirit in nature, the object treated by anthropology. B, mediate or explicit, still as identical reflection into itself and into other things, mind in correlation or particularization, consciousness the object treated. B, why the phenomenology of mind. C, mind defining itself in itself, as an independent subject, the object treated by psychology. In the soul is the awaking of consciousness. Consciousness sets itself up as reason, awaking at one bound to the sense of its rationality, and this reason by its activity emancipates itself to objectivity and the consciousness of its intelligent unity. For an intelligible unity or principle of comprehension, each modification it presents is an advance of development, and so in mind every character under which it appears is a stage in a process of specification and development, a step forward towards its goal, in order to make itself into, and to realize in itself, what it implicitly is. Each step, again, is itself such a process, and its product is that what the mind was implicitly at the beginning, and so for the observer, it is for itself for the special form, viz., which the mind has in that step. The ordinary method of psychology is to narrate what the mind or soul is, what happens to it, what it does. The soul is presupposed as a ready-made agent, which displays such features as its acts and utterances, from which we can learn what it is, what sort of faculties and powers it possesses, all without being aware that the act and utterance of what the soul is really invests it with that character in our conception and makes it reach a higher stage of being than it explicitly had before. We must, however, distinguish and keep apart from the progress here to be studied what we call education and instruction. The sphere of education is the individual's only, and its aim is to bring the universal mind to exist in them. But in the philosophic theory of mind, mind is studied as self-instruction and self-education in very essence, and its acts and utterances are stages in the process which brings it forward to itself, links it in unity with itself, and so makes it actual mind. Subsection A, Anthropology, the soul. A, the physical soul. A, physical qualities. B, physical alterations. C, sensibility. B, the feeling soul. A, the feeling soul in its immediacy. B, self-feeling. C, habit. C, the actual soul. A, anthropology. The soul. Philosophy of mind. Section 1, Mind Subjective 4, 388 Spirit, mind, came into being as the truth of nature. But not merely is it, as such a result, to be held the true and real first of what went before. This becoming or transition bears in the sphere of the notion the special meaning of free judgment. Mind, thus come into being, means therefore that nature in its own self realizes its untruth and sets itself aside. It means that mind presupposes itself no longer as the universality which in corporal individuality is always self-externalized, but as a universality which in its concretion and totality is one and simple. At such a stage it is not yet mind, but soul. 389 The soul is no separate immaterial entity. Wherever there is nature, the soul is its universal immaterialism, its simple ideal life. Soul is the substance or absolute basis of all the particularizing and individualizing of mind. It is in the soul that mind finds the material on which its character is wrought, and the soul remains the pervading, identical ideality of it all. But as it is still conceived thus abstractly, the soul is only the sleep of mind, the passive of Aristotle, which is potentially all things. The question of the immateriality of the soul has no interest, except where, on the one hand, matter is regarded as something true, and mind conceived as a thing, on the other. But in modern times even the physicists have found matters grow thinner in their hands. They have come upon imponderable matters, like heat, light, etc., to which they might perhaps add space and time. These imponderables, which have lost the property, peculiar to matter, of gravity and, in a sense, even the capacity of offering resistance, have still, however, a sensible existence and outness of part to part, whereas the vital matter, which may also be found enumerated among them, not merely lacks gravity, but even every other aspect of existence which might lead us to treat it as material. The fact is that in the idea of life the self-externalism of nature is implicitly at an end. Subjectivity is the very substance and conception of life, with this proviso, however, that its existence or objectivity is still at the same time forfeit ed to the away of self-externalism. It is otherwise with mind. There, in the intelligible unity which exists as freedom, as absolute negativity, and not as the immediate or natural individual, the object or the reality of the intelligible unity is the unity itself, and so the self-externalism, which is the fundamental feature of matter, has been completely dissipated and transmuted into universality, or the subjective ideality of the conceptual unity. Mind is the existent truth of matter, the truth that matter itself has no truth. A cognate question is that of the community of soul and body. This community, interdependence, was assumed as a fact, and the only problem was how to comprehend it. The usual answer, perhaps, was to call it an incomprehensible mystery, and, indeed, if we take them to be absolutely antithetical and absolutely independent, they are as impenetrable to each other as one piece of matter to another, each being supposed to be found only in the pores of the other, i.e. where the other is not, whence Epicurus, when attributing to the gods a residence in the pores, was consistent in not imposing on them any connection with the world. A somewhat different answer has been given by all philosophers since this relation came to be expressly discussed. Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza, and Leibniz have all indicated God as this nexus. They meant that the finitude of soul and matter were only ideal and unreal distinctions, and, so holding, their philosophers took God, not, as so often is done, merely as another word for the incomprehensible, but rather as the sole true identity of finite mind and matter. But either this identity, as in the case of Spinoza, is too abstract, or, as in the case of Leibniz, though his monad of monads brings things into being, it does so only by an act of judgment or choice. Hence, with Leibniz, the result is a distinction between soul and the corporeal, or material, and the identity is only like the copula of a judgment, and does not rise or develop into system, into the absolute syllogism. 390 The soul is at first, a, in its immediate natural mode the natural soul, which only is. b, secondly, it is a soul which feels, as individualized, enters into correlation with its immediate being, and, in the modes of that being, retains an abstract independence. c, thirdly, its immediate being or corporeity is molded into it, and with that corporeity it exists as actual soul. Philosophy of Mind. Section 1 Mind Subjective 5, a, the physical soul, 1. 391 The soul universal, described, it may be, as an anima mundi, a world soul, must not be fixed on that account as a single subject, it is rather the universal substance which has its actual truth only in individuals and single subjects. Thus, when it presents itself as a single soul, it is a single soul which is merely, its only modes are modes of natural life. These have, so to speak, behind its ideality a free existence, i.e. they are natural objects for consciousness, but objects to which the soul as such does not behave as to something external. These features rather are physical qualities of which it finds itself possessed. a. Physical qualities, 2. 392, 1. While still a substance, i.e. a physical soul, the mind takes part in the general planetary life, feels the difference of climates, the changes of the seasons, and the periods of the day, etc. This life of nature for the main shows itself only in occasional strain or disturbance of mental tone. In recent times a good deal has been said of the cosmical, sidereal, and telluric life of man. In such a Sympathy with nature. The animals essentially live, their specific characters and their particular phases of growth depend, in many cases completely, and always more or less, upon it. In the case of man, these points of dependence lose importance, just in proportion to his civilization, and the more his whole frame of soul is based upon a substructure of mental freedom. The history of the world is not bound up with revolutions in the solar system, any more than the destinies of individuals with the positions of the planets. The difference of climate has a more solid and vigorous influence. But the response to the changes of the seasons and hours of the day is found only in faint changes of mood, which come expressly to the fore only in morbid states, including insanity, and at periods when the self-conscious life suffers depression. In nations less intellectually emancipated, which therefore live more in harmony with nature, we find amid their superstitions and aberrations of imbecility a few real cases of such sympathy, and on that foundation what seems to be marvelous prophetic vision of coming conditions and of events arising therefrom. But as mental freedom gets a deeper hold, even these few and slight susceptibilities, based upon participation in the common life of nature, disappear. Animals and plants, on the contrary, remain forever subject to such influences. 393. 2. According to the concrete differences of the terrestrial globe, the general planetary life of the nature-governed mind specializes itself and breaks up into the several nature-governed minds which, on the whole, give expression to the nature of the geographical continents and constitute the diversities of race. The contrast between the Earth's poles, the land towards the North Pole being more aggregated and preponderant over sea, whereas in the southern hemisphere it runs out in sharp points, widely distant from each other, introduces into the differences of continents a further modification which Treviranus, Biology, Part 2, has exhibited in the case of the flora and fauna. 394. This diversity descends into specialities, that may be termed local minds shown in the outward modes of life and occupation, bodily structure and disposition, but still more in the inner tendency and capacity of the intellectual and moral character of the several peoples. Back to the very beginnings of national history we see the several nations each possessing a persistent type of its own. 395. 3. The soul is further de-universalized into the individualized subject. But this subjectivity is here only considered as a differentiation and singling out of the modes which nature gives. We find it as the special philosophy of mind. Section 1. Mind subjective. 6. Temperament, talent, character, physiognomy, or other disposition and idiosyncrasy, of families or single individuals. b. Physical alterations. 396. Taking the soul as an individual, we find its diversities, as alterations in it, the one permanent subject, and as stages in its development. As they are at once physical and mental diversities, a more concrete definition or description of them would require us to anticipate an acquaintance with the formed and matured mind. 1. The first of these is the natural lapse of the ages in man's life. He begins with childhood mind wrapped up in itself. His next step is the fully developed antithesis, the strain and struggle of a universality which is still subjective, as seen in ideals, fancies, hopes, ambitions, against his immediate individuality. And that individuality marks both the world which, as it exists, fails to meet his ideal requirements, and the position of the individual himself, who is still short of independence and not fully equipped for the part he has to play. Youth. Thirdly, we see man in his true relation to his environment, recognizing the objective necessity and reasonableness of the world as he finds it, a world no longer incomplete, but able in the work which it collectively achieves to afford the individual a place and a security for his performance. By his share in this collective work he first is really somebody, gaining an effective existence and an objective value, manhood. Last of all comes the finishing touch to this unity with objectivity, a unity which, while on its realist side it passes into the inertia of deadening habit, on its idealist side gains freedom from the limited interests and Entanglements of the outward present, old age. 397. 2. Next we find the individual subject to a real antithesis, leading it to seek and find itself in another individual. This the sexual relation on a physical basis, shows, on its one side, subjectivity remaining in an instinctive and emotional harmony of moral life and love, and not pushing these tendencies to an extreme universal phase, in purposes political, scientific, or artistic, and on the other, shows an active half, where the individual is the vehicle of a struggle of universal and objective interests with the given conditions, both of his own existence and of that of the external world, carrying out these universal principles into a unity with the world which is his own work. The sexual tie acquires its moral and spiritual significance and function in the family. 398. 3. When the individuality, or self-centralized being, distinguishes itself from its mere being, this immediate judgment is the waking of the soul, which confronts its self-absorbed natural life, in the first instance, as one natural quality and state confronts another state, viz. sleep. The waking is not merely for the observer, or externally distinct from the sleep, it is itself the judgment, primary partition, of the individual soul which is self-existing only as it relates its self-existence to its mere existence, distinguishing itself from its still undifferentiated universality. The waking state includes generally all self-conscious and rational activity in which the mind realizes its own distinct self. Sleep is an invigoration of this activity not as a merely negative rest from it, but as a return back from the world of specialization. From dispersion into phases where it has grown hard and stiff, a return into the general nature of subjectivity, which is the substance of those specialized energies and their absolute master. The distinction between sleep and waking is one of those poses, as they may be called, which are often addressed to philosophy. Napoleon, for example, on a visit to the University of Pavia, put this question to the class of ideology. The characterization given in the section is abstract, it primarily treats waking merely as a natural fact, containing the mental element implicate, but not yet as invested with a special being of its own. If we are to speak more concretely of this distinction, in fundamentals it remains the same. We must take the self-existence of the individual soul in its higher aspects as the ego of consciousness and as intelligent mind. The difficulty raised anent the distinction of the two states properly arises, only when we also take into account the dreams in sleep and describe these dreams, as well as the mental representations in Philosophy of Mind. Section 1 Mind Subjective 7 The sober waking consciousness under one and the same title of mental representations. Thus superficially classified as states of mental representation, the two coincide, because we have lost sight of the difference. And in the case of any assignable distinction of waking consciousness, we can always return to the trivial remark that all this is nothing more than mental idea. But the concrete theory of the waking soul in its realized being views it as consciousness and intellect, and the world of intelligent consciousness is something quite different from a picture of mere ideas and images. The latter are in the main only externally conjoined, in an unintelligent way, by the laws of the so-called association of ideas, though here and there of course logical principles may also be operative. But in the waking state man behaves essentially as a concrete ego, an intelligence, and because of this intelligence his sense perception stands before him as a concrete totality of features in which each member, each point, takes up its place as at the same time determined through and with all the rest. Thus the facts embodied in his sensation are authenticated, not by his mere subjective representation and distinction of the facts as something external from the person, but by virtue of the concrete interconnection in which each part stands with all parts of this complex. The waking state is the concrete consciousness of this mutual corroboration of each single factor of its content by all the others in the picture, as perceived. The consciousness of this interdependence need not be explicit and distinct. Still this general setting to all sensations is implicitly present in the concrete feeling of self. In order to see the difference between dreaming and waking, we need only keep in view the Kantian distinction between subjectivity and objectivity of mental representation, the latter depending upon determination through categories. Remembering, as already noted, that what is actually present in mind need not be therefore explicitly realized in consciousness, just as little as the exaltation of the intellectual sense to God need stand before consciousness in the shape of proofs of God's existence, although, as before explained, these proofs only serve to express the net worth and content of that feeling. See, Sensibility, 3. 399. Sleep and waking are, primarily, it is true, not mere alterations, but alternating conditions, a progression in infinitum. This is their formal and negative relationship, but in it the affirmative relationship is also involved. In the self-certified existence of waking soul, its mere existence is implicit as an ideal factor. The features which make up its sleeping nature, where they are implicitly as in their substance, are found by the waking soul, in its own self, and, be it noted, for itself. The fact that these particulars, though as a mode of mind they are distinguished from the self-identity of our self-centered being, are yet simply contained in its simplicity, is what we call sensibility. 400. Sensibility, feeling, is the form of the dull stirring, the inarticulate breathing, of the spirit through its unconscious and unintelligent individuality, where every definite feature is still immediate, neither specially developed in its content nor set in distinction as objective to subject, but treated as belonging to its most special, its natural peculiarity. The content of sensation is thus limited and transient, belonging as it does to natural, immediate being, to what is therefore qualitative and finite. Everything is in sensation, feeling if you will, everything that emerges in conscious intelligence and in reason has its source and origin in sensation, for source and origin just means the first immediate manner in which a thing appears. Let it not be enough to have principles and religion only in the head, they must so be in the heart, in the feeling. What we merely have in the head is in consciousness, in a general way, the facts of it are objective set over against consciousness, so that as it is put in me, my abstract ego, it can also be kept away and apart from me, from my concrete subjectivity. But if put in the feeling, the fact is a mode of my individuality, however crude that individuality be in such a form, it is thus treated as my very own. My own is something inseparate from the actual concrete self, and this immediate unity of the soul with its underlying self in all its definite content is just this inseparability, which, however, yet falls short of the ego of developed consciousness, and still more of the freedom of rational mind life. It is with a quite different intensity and permanency that the will, the conscience, and the character, are our very own, than can ever be true of feeling and of the group of feelings, the heart, and this we need no philosophy to tell us. No doubt it. Philosophy of Mind. Section 1. Mind Subjective 8. Is correct to say that above everything the heart must be good. But feeling and heart is not the form by which anything is legitimated as religious, moral, true, just, etc., and an appeal to heart and feeling either means nothing or means something bad. This should hardly need enforcing. Can any experience be more trite than that feelings and hearts are also bad, evil, godless, mean, etc.? That the heart is the source only of such feelings is stated in the words, "From the heart proceed evil thoughts, murder, adultery, fornication, blasphemy, etc." In such times when scientific theology and philosophy make the heart and feeling the criterion of what is good, moral, and religious, it is necessary to remind them of these trite experiences, just as it is nowadays necessary to repeat that thinking is the characteristic property by which man is distinguished from the beasts, and that he has feeling in common with them. 401. What the sentient soul finds within it is, on one hand, the naturally immediate, as ideally in it and made its own. On the other hand, and conversely, what originally belongs to the central individuality, which, as further deepened and enlarged is the conscious ego and free mind, gets the features of the natural corporeity, and is so felt. In this way we have two spheres of feeling. 1. Where what at first is a corporeal affection, for example of the eye or of any bodily part whatever, is made feeling, sensation, by being driven inward, memorized in the soul's self-centered part. Another, where affections originating in the mind and belonging to it, are in order to be felt, and to be as if found, invested with corporeity. Thus the mode or affection gets a place in the subject, it is felt in the soul. The detailed specification of the former branch of sensibility is seen in the system of the senses. But the other or inwardly originated modes of feeling no less necessarily systematize themselves, and their corporization, as put in the living and concretely developed natural being, works itself out, following the special character of the mental mode, in a special system of bodily organs. Sensibility in general is the healthy fellowship of the individual mind in the life of its bodily part. The senses form the simple system of corporeity specified. A. The ideal side of physical things breaks up into two, because in it, as immediate and not yet subjective ideality, distinction appears as mere variety. The senses of definite light, 317, and of sound, 300. The real aspect similarly is with its difference double, b. The senses of smell and taste, 321, 322, c. The sense of solid reality, of heavy matter, of heat, 303, and shape, 310. Around the center of the sentient individuality these specifications arrange themselves more simply than when they are developed in the natural corporeity. The system by which the internal sensation comes to give itself specific bodily forms would deserve to be treated in detail in a peculiar science of psychical physiology. Somewhat pointing to such a system is implied in the feeling of the appropriateness or inappropriateness of an immediate sensation to the persistent tone of internal sensibility, the pleasant and unpleasant, as also in the distinct parallelism which underlies the symbolical employment of sensations, for example of colors, tones, smells. But the most interesting side of a psychical physiology would lie in studying not the mere sympathy, but more definitely the bodily form adopted by certain mental modifications, especially the passions or emotions. We should have, for example, to explain the line of connection by which anger and courage are felt in the breast, the blood, the irritable system, just as thinking and mental occupation are felt in the head, the center of the sensible system. We should want a more satisfactory explanation than hitherto of the most familiar connections by which tears, and voice in general, with its varieties of language, laughter, sighs, with many other specializations lying in the line of pathognomy and physiognomy, are formed from their mental source. In physiology the viscera and the organs are treated merely as parts subservient to the animal organism, but they form at the same time a physical system for the expression of mental states, and in this way they get quite another interpretation. 402 sensations, just because they are immediate and are found existing, single and transient aspects of psychic life, alterations in the substantiality of the soul, set in its self-centered life, with which that substance is one. But this self-centered being is not merely a formal factor of sensation, the soul is virtually a reflected totality of sensations. It feels in itself the total substantiality which it virtually is. It is a soul which feels. Philosophy of Mind. Section 1 Mind Subjective 9 In the usage of ordinary language, sensation and feeling are not clearly distinguished, still we do not speak of the sensation but of the feeling, sense, of right, of self. Sentimentality, sensibility, is connected with sensation. We may therefore say sensation emphasizes rather the side of passivity, the fact that we find ourselves feeling, i.e. the immediacy of mode in feeling, whereas feeling at the same time rather notes the fact that it is we ourselves who feel. b. The feeling soul, soul as sentiency, 4. 403 The feeling or sentient individual is the simple ideality or subjective side of sensation. What it has to do, therefore, is to raise its substantiality, its merely virtual filling up, to the character of subjectivity, to take possession of it, to realize its mastery over its own. As sentient, the soul is no longer a mere natural, but an inward individuality, the individuality which in the merely substantial totality was only formal to it has to be liberated and made independent. Nowhere so much as in the case of the soul, and still more of the mind, if we are to understand it, must that feature of ideality be kept in view, which represents it as the negation of the real, but a negation, where the real is put past, virtually retained, although it does not exist. The feature is one with which we are familiar in regard to our mental ideas or to memory. Every individual is an infinite treasury of sensations, ideas, acquired law, thoughts, etc., and yet the ego is one and uncompounded, a deep featureless characterless mine, in which all this is stored up, without existing. It is only when I call to mind an idea, that I bring it out of that interior to existence before consciousness. Sometimes, in sickness, ideas and information, supposed to have been forgotten years ago, because for so long they had not been brought into consciousness, once more come to light. They were not in our possession, nor by such reproduction as occurs in sickness do they for the future come into our possession, and yet they were in us and continue to be in us still. Thus a person can never know how much of things he once learned he really has in him, should he have once forgotten them. They belong not to his actuality or subjectivity as such, but only to his implicit self. And under all the superstructure of specialized and instrumental consciousness that may subsequently be added to it, the individuality always remains this single-souled inner life. At the present stage this singleness is, primarily, to be defined as one of feeling as embracing the corporeal in itself, thus denying the view that this body is something material, with parts outside parts and outside the soul. Just as the number and variety of mental representations is no argument for an extended and real multity in the ego, so the real outness of parts in the body has no truth for the sentient soul. As sentient, the soul is characterized as immediate, and so as natural and corporeal, but the outness of parts and sensible multiplicity of this corporeal counts for the soul, as it counts for the intelligible unity, not as anything real, and therefore not as a barrier. The soul is this intelligible unity in existence, the existent speculative principle. Thus in the body it is one simple, omnipresent unity. As to the representative faculty, the body is but one representation, and the infinite variety of its material structure and organization is reduced to the simplicity of one definite conception. So in the sentient soul, the corporeity, and all that outness of parts to parts which belongs to it, is reduced to ideality, the truth of the natural multiplicity. The soul is virtually the totality of nature. As an individual soul it is a monad, it is itself the explicitly put totality of its particular world, that world being included in it and filling it up, and to that world it stands but as to itself. 404 As individual, the soul is exclusive and always exclusive. Any difference here is, it brings within itself what is differentiated from it is as yet no external object, as in consciousness, but only the aspects of its own sentient totality, etc. In this partition, judgment, of itself it is always subject, its object is its substance, which is at the same time its predicate. This substance is still the content of its natural life, but turned into the content of the individual sensation-laden soul, yet as the soul is in that content still particular, the content is its particular world, so far as that is, in an implicit mode, included in the ideality of the subject. By itself, this stage of mind is the stage of its darkness. Its features are not developed to conscious and intelligent content, so far it is formal and only formal. It acquires a peculiar interest in cases where it is as a philosophy of mind. Section 1 Mind Subjective 10 Form and appears as a special state of mind, 380, to which the soul, which has already advanced to consciousness and intelligence, may again sink down. But when a true phase of mind thus exists in a more subordinate and abstract one, it implies a want of adaptation, which is disease. In the present stage we must treat, first, of the abstract psychical modifications by themselves, secondly, as morbid states of mind, the latter being only explicable by means of the former. A. The feeling soul in its immediacy. 405, a. Though the sensitive individuality is undoubtedly a monadic individual, it is, because immediate. Not yet as itself, not a true subject reflected into itself, and is therefore passive. Hence the individuality of its true self is a different subject from it, a subject which may even exist as another individual. By the selfhood of the latter it a substance, which is only a non-independent predicate, is then set in vibration, and controlled without the least resistance on its part. This other subject by which it is so controlled may be called its genius. In the ordinary course of nature this is the condition of the child in its mother's womb, a condition neither merely bodily nor merely mental, but psychical, a correlation of soul to soul. Here are two individuals, yet in undivided psychic unity, the one as yet no self, as yet nothing impenetrable, incapable of resistance, the other is its actuating subject, the single self of the two. The mother is the genius of the child, for by genius we commonly mean the total mental selfhood, as it has existence of its own, and constitutes the subjective substantiality of someone else who is only externally treated as an individual and has only a nominal independence. The underlying essence of the genius is the sum total of existence, of life, and of character, not as a mere possibility, or capacity, or virtuality, but as efficiency and realized activity, as concrete subjectivity. If we look only to the spatial and material aspects of the child's existence as an embryo in its special instruments, and as connected with the mother by means of umbilical cord, placenta, etc., all that is presented to the senses and reflection are certain anatomical and physiological facts, externalities and instrumentalities in the sensible and material, which are insignificant as regards the main point, the psychical relationship. What ought to be noted as regards this psychical tie are not merely the striking effects communicated to and stamped upon the child by violent emotions, injuries, etc., of the mother, but the whole psychical judgment partition of the underlying nature, by which the female, like the monocotyledons among vegetables, can suffer disruption in twain, so that the child has not merely got communicated to it, but has originally received morbid dispositions as well as other predispositions of shape, temper, character, talent, idiosyncrasies, etc. Sporadic examples and traces of this magic tie appear elsewhere in the range of self-possessed conscious life, say between friends, especially female friends with delicate nerves, a tie which may go so far as to show magnetic phenomena between husband and wife and between members of the same family. The total sensitivity has itself here in a separate subjectivity, which, in the case cited of this sentient life in the ordinary course of nature, is visibly present as another and a different individual. But this sensitive totality is meant to elevate its selfhood out of itself to subjectivity in one and the same individual, which is then its indwelling consciousness, self-possessed, intelligent, and reasonable. For such a consciousness the merely sentient life serves as an underlying and only implicitly existent material, and the self-possessed subjectivity is the rational, self-conscious, controlling genius thereof. But this sensitive nucleus includes not merely the purely unconscious, congenital disposition and temperament, but within its enveloping simplicity it acquires and retains also, in habit, as to which see later, all further ties and essential relationships, fortunes, principles, everything in short belonging to the character, and in whose elaboration self-conscious activity has most effectively participated. The sensitivity is thus a soul in which the whole mental life is condensed. The total individual under this concentrated aspect is distinct from the existing and actual play of his consciousness, his secular ideas, developed interests, inclinations, etc. As contrasted with this looser aggregate of means and methods, the more intensive form of individuality is termed the genius, whose philosophy of mind Section 1 Mind Subjective 11 Decision is ultimate whatever may be the show of reasons, intentions, means, of which the more public. Consciousness is so liberal. This concentrated individuality also reveals itself under the aspect of what is called the heart and soul of feeling. A man is said to be heartless and unfeeling when he looks at things with self-possession and acts according to his permanent purposes, be they great substantial aims or petty and unjust interests. A good-hearted man, on the other hand, means rather one who is at the mercy of his individual sentiment, even when it is of narrow range and is wholly made up of particularities. Of such good nature or goodness of heart it may be said that it is less the genius itself than the indulged genio. 406. bb. The sensitive life, when it becomes a form or state of the self-conscious, educated, self-possessed human being is a disease. The individual in such a morbid state stands in direct contact with the concrete contents of his own self, whilst he keeps his self-possessed consciousness of self and of the causal order of things apart as a distinct state of mind. This morbid condition is seen in magnetic somnambulism and cognate states. In this summary encyclopedic account it is impossible to supply a demonstration of what the paragraph states as the nature of the remarkable condition produced chiefly by animal magnetism to show, in other words, that it is in harmony with the facts. To that end the phenomena, so complex in their nature and so very different one from another, would have first of all to be brought under their general points of view. The facts, it might seem, first of all call for verification. But such a verification would, it must be added, be superfluous. For those on whose account it was called for they facilitate the inquiry for themselves by declaring the narratives infinitely numerous though they be and accredited by the education and character of the witnesses to be mere deception and imposture. The a priori conceptions of these inquirers are so rooted that no testimony can avail against them, and they have even denied what they have seen with their own eyes. In order to believe in this department even what one's own eyes have seen and still more to understand it, the first requisite is not to be in bondage to the hard and fast categories of the practical intellect. The chief points on which the discussion turns may here be given. A. To the concrete existence of the individual belongs the aggregate of his fundamental interests, both the essential and the particular empirical ties which connect him with other men and the world at large. This totality forms his actuality, in the sense that it lies in fact immanent in him. It has already been called his genius. This genius is not the free mind which wills and thinks, the form of sensitivity, in which the individual here appears innocent, is, on the contrary, a surrender of his self-possessed intelligent existence. The first conclusion to which these considerations lead, with reference to the contents of consciousness in the somnambulist stage, is that it is only the range of his individually molded world, of his private interests and narrow relationships, which appear there. Scientific theories and philosophic conceptions or general truths require a different soil, require an intelligence which has risen out of the inarticulate mass of mere sensitivity to free consciousness. It is foolish therefore to expect revelations about the higher ideas from the somnambulist state. b. Where a human being's senses and intellect are sound, he is fully and intelligently alive to that reality of his which gives concrete filling to his individuality, but he is awake to it in the form of interconnection between himself and the features of that reality conceived as an external and a separate world, and he is aware that this world is in itself also a complex of interconnections of a practically intelligible kind. In his subjective ideas and plans he has also before him this causally connected scheme of things he calls his world, and the series of means which bring his ideas and his purposes into adjustment with the objective existences, which are also means and ends to each other. At the same time, this world which is outside him has its threads in him to such a degree that it is these threads which make him what he really is. He too would become extinct if these externalities were to disappear, unless by the aid of religion, subjective reason, and character, he is in a remarkable degree self-supporting and independent of them. But, then, in the latter case, he is less susceptible of the psychical state here spoken of. As an illustration of that identity with the surroundings, may be noted the effect produced by the death of beloved relatives, friends, etc. on those left. Philosophy of Mind. Section 1 Mind Subjective 12 Behind, so that the one dies or pines away with the loss of the other. Thus Cato, after the downfall of the Roman Republic, could live no longer, his inner reality was neither wider nor higher than it. Compare homesickness, and the like. C. But when all that occupies the waking consciousness, the world outside it and its relationship to that world, is under a veil, and the soul is thus sunk in sleep, in magnetic sleep, in catalepsy, and other diseases. For example, those connected with female development, or at the approach of death, etc., then that immanent actuality of the individual remains the same substantial total as before, but now as a purely sensitive life with an inward vision and an inward consciousness. And because it is the adult, formed, and developed consciousness which is degraded into this state of sensitivity, it retains along with its content a certain nominal selfhood, a formal vision and awareness, which, however, does not go so far as the conscious judgment or discernment by which its contents, when it is healthy and awake, exist for it as an outward objectivity. The individual is thus a monad which is inwardly aware of its actuality, a genius which beholds itself. The characteristic point in such knowledge is that the very same facts, which for the healthy consciousness are an objective practical reality, and to know which, in its sober moods, it needs the intelligent chain of means and conditions in all their real expansion, are now immediately known and perceived in this immanence. This perception is a sort of clairvoyance, for it is a consciousness living in the undivided substantiality of the genius, and finding itself in the very heart of the interconnection, and so can dispense with the series of conditions, external one to another, which lead up to the result conditions which cool reflection has in succession to traverse, and in so doing feels the limits of its own external individuality. But such clairvoyance, just because its dim and turbid vision does not present the facts in a rational interconnection, is for that very reason at the mercy of every private contingency of feeling and fancy, etc. Not to mention that foreign suggestions, see later, intrude into its vision. It is thus impossible to make out whether what the clairvoyants really see preponderates over what they deceive themselves in. But it is absurd to treat this visionary state as a sublime mental phase and as a true state, capable of conveying general truths. 5. D. An essential feature of this sensitivity, with its absence of intelligent and volitional personality, is this: that it is a state of passivity, like that of the child in the womb. The patient in this condition is accordingly made, and continues to be, subject to the power of another person, the magnetizer, so that when the two are thus in psychical rapport, the selfless individual, not really a person, has for his subjective consciousness the consciousness of the other. This latter self-possessed individual is thus the effective subjective soul of the former, and the genius which may even supply him with a train of ideas that the somnambulist perceives in himself, tastes and smells which are present in the person with whom he stands en rapport, and that he is aware of the other inner ideas and present perceptions of the latter as if they were his own, shows the substantial identity which the soul, which even in its concreteness is also truly immaterial, is capable of holding with another. When the substance of both is thus made one, there is only one subjectivity of consciousness. The patient has a sort of individuality, but it is empty, not on the spot, not actual, and this nominal self accordingly derives its whole stock of ideas from the sensations and ideas of the other, in whom it sees, smells, tastes, reads, and hears. It is further to be noted on this point that the somnambulist is thus brought into rapport with two genii and a twofold set of ideas, his own and that of the magnetizer. But it is impossible to say precisely which sensations and which visions he, in this nominal perception, receives, beholds, and brings to knowledge from his own inward self, and which from the suggestions of the person with whom he stands in relation. This uncert Ain't may be the source of many deceptions, and accounts, among other things, for the diversity that inevitably shows itself among somnambulists from different countries and under rapport with persons of different education, as regards their views on morbid states and the methods of cure, or medicines for them, as well as on scientific and intellectual topics. As in this sensitive substantiality there is no contrast to external objectivity, so within itself the subject is so entirely one that all varieties of sensation have disappeared, and hence, when the activity of the sense organs is asleep, the common sense, or general feeling specifies itself to several functions, one sees. Philosophy of Mind. Section 1 Mind Subjective 13 and hears with the fingers, and especially with the pit of the stomach, etc. To comprehend a thing means in the language of practical intelligence to be able to trace the series of means intervening between a phenomenon and some other existence on which it depends to discover what is called the ordinary course of nature, in compliance with the laws and relations of the intellect, for example, causality, reasons, etc. The purely sensitive life, on the contrary, even when it retains that mere nominal consciousness, as in the morbid state alluded to, is just this form of immediacy, without any distinctions between subjective and objective, between intelligent personality and objective world, and without the aforementioned finite ties between them. Hence to understand this intimate conjunction, which, though all-embracing, is without any definite points of attachment, is impossible, so long as we assume independent personalities, independent one of another and of the objective world which is their content, so long as we assume the absolute spatial and material externality of one part of being to another. B. Self-feeling, sense of self, 6. 407, a. The sensitive totality is, in its capacity as individual, essentially the tendency to distinguish itself in itself, and to wake up to the judgment in itself, in virtue of which it has particular feelings and stands as a subject in respect of these aspects of itself. The subject as such gives these feelings a place as its own in itself. In these private and personal sensations it is immersed, and at the same time, because of the ideality of the particulars, it combines itself in them with itself as a subjective unit. In this way it is self-feeling, and is so at the same time only in the particular feeling. 408, bb. In consequence of the immediacy, which still marks the self-feeling, i.e. in consequence of the element of corporeality which is still undetached from the mental life, and as the feeling too is itself particular and bound up with a special corporeal form, it follows that although the subject has been brought to acquire intelligent consciousness, it is still susceptible of disease, so far as to remain fast in a special pace of its self-feeling, unable to refine it to ideality and get the better of it. The fully furnished self of intelligent consciousness is a conscious subject, which is consistent in itself according to an order and behavior which follows from its individual position and its connection with the external world, which is no less a world of law. But when it is engrossed with a single phase of feeling, it fails to assign that phase its proper place and due subordination in the individual system of the world which a conscious subject is. In this way the subject finds itself in contradiction between the totality systematized in its consciousness, and the single phase or fixed idea which is not reduced to its proper place and rank. This is insanity or mental derangement. In considering insanity we must, as in other cases, anticipate the full-grown and intelligent conscious subject, which is at the same time the natural self of self-feeling. In such a phase the self can be liable to the contradiction between its own free subjectivity and a particularity which, instead of being idealized in the former, remains as a fixed element in self-feeling. Mind as such is free, and therefore not susceptible of this malady. But in older metaphysics mind was treated as a soul, as a thing, and it is only as a thing, i.e. as something natural and existent, that it is liable to insanity, the settled fixture of some finite element in it. Insanity is therefore a psychical disease, i.e. a disease of body and mind alike. The commencement may appear to start from the one more than the other, and so also may the cure. The self-possessed and healthy subject has an active and present consciousness of the ordered whole of his individual world, into the system of which he subsumes each special content of sensation, idea, desire, inclination, etc., as it arises, so as to insert them in their proper place. He is the dominant genius over these particularities. Between this and insanity the difference is like that between waking and dreaming, only that in insanity the dream falls within the waking limits, and so makes part of the actual self-feeling. Error and that sort of thing is a proposition consistently admitted to a place in the objective interconnection of things. In the concrete, however, it is often difficult to say where it begins to become derangement. A violent, but groundless and senseless outburst of hatred, etc., may, in contrast to a presupposed higher self-possession. Philosophy of Mind. Section 1 Mind Subjective 14 and Stability of Character, make its victim seem to be beside himself with frenzy. But the main point in derangement is the contradiction which a feeling with a fixed corporeal embodiment sets up against the whole mass of adjustments forming the concrete consciousness. The mind which is in a condition of mere being, and where such being is not rendered fluid in its consciousness, is diseased. The contents which are set free in this reversion to mere nature are the self-seeking affections of the heart, such as vanity, pride, and the rest of the passions, fancies and hopes, merely personal love and hatred. When the influence of self-possession and of general principles, moral and theoretical, is relaxed, and ceases to keep the natural temper under lock and key, the earthly elements are set free, that evil which is always latent in the heart. Because the heart as immediate is natural and selfish, it is the evil genius of man which gains the upper hand. In insanity, but in distinction from and contrast to the better and more intelligent part, which is there also. Hence this state is mental derangement and distress. The right psychical treatment therefore keeps in view the truth that insanity is not an abstract loss of reason, neither in the point of intelligence nor of will and its responsibility, but only derangement, only a contradiction in a still subsisting reason, just as physical disease is not an abstract, i.e. mere and total, loss of health. If it were that, it would be death, but a contradiction in it. This humane treatment, no less benevolent than reasonable, the services of Pinel towards which deserve the highest acknowledgement, presupposes the patient's rationality, and in that assumption has the sound basis for dealing with him on this side, just as in the case of bodily disease the physician bases his treatment on the vitality which as such still conter ins health. C. Habit, 7. 409 Self-feeling, immersed in the detail of the feelings, in simple sensations, and also desires, instincts, passions, and their gratification, is undistinguished from them. But in the self there is latent a simple self-relation of ideality, a nominal universality, which is the truth of these details, and as so universal, the self is to be stamped upon, and made appear in this life of feeling, yet so as to distinguish itself from the particular details, and be a realized universality. But this universality is not the full and sterling truth of the specific feelings and desires. What they specifically contain is as yet left out of account. And so too the particularity is, as now regarded, equally formal. It counts only as the particular being or immediacy of the soul in opposition to its equally formal and abstract realization. This particular being of the soul is the factor of its corporeity. Here we have it breaking with this corporeity, distinguishing it from itself a simple being, and becoming the ideal, subjective substantiality of it, just as in its latent notion. 389, it was the substance, and the mere substance, of it. But this abstract realization of the soul in its corporeal vehicle is not yet the self, not the existence of the universal which is for the universal. It is the corporeity reduced to its mere ideality, and so far only does corporeity belong to the soul as such. That is to say, just as space and time as the abstract, one outside another, as, therefore, empty space and empty time are only subjective forms, a pure act of intuition, so is that pure being, which, through the supersession in it of the particularity of the corporeity, or of the immediate corporeity as such, has realized itself, mere intuition and no more, lacking consciousness. But the basis of consciousness. And consciousness it becomes, when the corpusity, of which it is the subjective substance, and which still continues to exist, and that as a barrier for it, has been absorbed by it. And it has been invested with the character of self-centered subject. 410 The soul's making itself an abstract universal being, and reducing the particulars of feelings, and of consciousness, to a mere feature of its being is habit. In this manner the soul has the contents in possession, and contains them in such manner that in these features it is not as sentient, nor does it stand in relationship with them as distinguishing itself from them, nor is absorbed in them, but has them and moves in them, without feeling or consciousness of the fact. The soul is freed from them, so far as it is not interested in or occupied with them, and whilst existing in these forms as its possession, it is at the same time open to be otherwise occupied and engaged, say, with feeling and with mental consciousness in general. Philosophy of Mind. Section 1 Mind Subjective 15 This process of building up the particular and corporeal expressions of feeling into the being of the soul appears as a repetition of them, and the generation of habit as practice. For this being of the soul, if in respect of the natural particular phase it be called an abstract universality to which the former is transmuted, is a reflexive universality, 175, i.e. the one and the same, that recurs in a series of units of sensation, is reduced to unity, and this abstract unity expressly stated. Habit, like memory, is a difficult point in mental organization. Habit is the mechanism of self-feeling, as memory is the mechanism of intelligence. The natural qualities and alterations of age, sleep, and waking are immediately natural. Habit, on the contrary, is the mode of feeling, as well as intelligence, will, etc., so far as they belong to self-feeling, made into a natural and mechanical existence. Habit is rightly called a second nature, because it is an immediate being of the soul; a second nature, because it is an immediacy created by the soul, impressing and molding the corporeality which enters into the modes of feeling as such, and into the representations and volitions so far as they have taken corporeal form. 401. In habit the human being's mode of existence is natural, and for that reason not free, but still free, so far as the merely natural phase of feeling is by habit reduced to a mere being of his, and he is no longer involuntarily attracted or repelled by it, and so no longer interested, occupied, or dependent in regard to it. The want of freedom in habit is partly merely formal, as habit merely attaches to the being of the soul, partly only relative, so far as it strictly speaking arises only in the case of bad habits, or so far as a habit is opposed by another purpose, whereas the habit of right and goodness is an embodiment of liberty. The main point about habit is that by its means man gets emancipated from the feelings, even in being affected by them. The different forms of this may be described as follows. A. The immediate feeling is negated and treated as indifferent. One who gets inured against external sensations, frost, heat, weariness of the limbs, etc., sweet tastes, etc., and who hardens the heart against misfortune, acquires a strength which consists in this, that although the frost, etc., or the misfortune is felt, the affection is deposed to a mere externality and immediacy. The universal psychical life keeps its own abstract independence in it, and the self-feeling as such, consciousness, reflection, and any other purposes and activity, are no longer bothered with it. B. There is indifference towards the satisfaction. The desires and impulses are by the habit of their satisfaction deadened. This is the rational liberation from them, whereas monastic renunciation and forcible interference do not free from them, nor are they in conception rational. Of course in all this it is assumed that the impulses are kept as the finite modes they naturally are, and that they, like their satisfaction, are subordinated as partial factors to the reasonable will. C. In habit regarded as aptitude, or skill, not merely has the abstract psychical life to be kept intact per se, but it has to be imposed as a subjective aim, to be made a power in the bodily part, which is rendered subject and thoroughly pervious to it. Conceived as having the inward purpose of the subjective soul thus imposed upon it, the body is treated as an immediate externality and a barrier. Thus comes out the more decided rupture between the soul as simple self-concentration, and its earlier naturalness and immediacy. It has lost its original and immediate identity with the bodily nature, and as external has first to be reduced to that position. Specific feelings can only get bodily shape in a perfectly specific way, 410. And the immediate portion of body is a particular possibility for a specific aim, a particular aspect of its differentiated structure, a particular organ of its organic system. To mold such an aim in the organic body is to bring out and express the ideality which is implicit in matter always, and especially so in the specific bodily part, and thus to enable the soul, under its volitional and conceptual characters, to exist as substance in its corporeity. In this way an aptitude shows the corporeity rendered completely pervious, made into an instrument, so that when the conception, for example a s of musical notes, is in me, then without resistance and with ease the body gives them correct utterance. The form of habit applies to all kinds and grades of mental action. The most external of them, i.e. the spatial direction of an individual, viz. his upright posture, has been by will made a habit, a position taken without adjustment and without consciousness, which continues to be an affair of his persistent will, for the man stands only because and in so far as he wills to stand, and only so long as he wills it without consciousness. Similarly our eyesight is the concrete habit which, without an express adjustment, combines in a single act. Philosophy of Mind. Section 1 Mind Subjective 16 The several modifications of sensation, consciousness, intuition, intelligence, etc., which make it up. Thinking, too, however free and active in its own pure element it becomes, no less requires habit and familiarity, this impromptuity or form of immediacy, by which it is the property of my single self where I can freely and in all directions range. It is through this habit that I come to realize my existence as a thinking being. Even here, in this spontaneity of self-centered thought, there is a partnership of soul and body, hence want of habit and too long continued thinking cause headache. Habit diminishes this feeling, by making the natural function an immediacy of the soul. Habit on an ampler scale, and carried out in the strictly intellectual range, is recollection and memory, whereof we shall speak later. Habit is often spoken of disparagingly and called lifeless, casual, and particular. And it is true that the form of habit, like any other, is open to anything we chance to put into it, and it is habit of living which brings on death, or, if quite abstract, is death itself, and yet habit is indispensable for the existence of all intellectual life. In the individual, enabling the subject to be a concrete immediacy, an ideality of soul enabling the matter of consciousness, religious, moral, etc., to be his as this self, this soul, and no other, and be neither a mere latent possibility, nor a transient emotion or idea, nor an abstract inwardness, cut off from action and reality, but part and parcel of his being. In scientific studies of the soul and the mind, habit is usually passed over, either as something contemptible or rather for the further reason that it is one of the most difficult questions of psychology. See, The Actual Soul, 8. 411 The soul, when its corporeity has been molded and made thoroughly its own, finds itself there a single subject, and the corporeity is an externality which stands as a predicate, in being related to which, it is related to itself. This externality, in other words, represents not itself, but the soul, of which it is the sign. In this identity of interior and exterior, the latter subject to the former, the soul is actual. In its corporeity it has its free shape. In WH. ICH it feels itself and makes itself felt, and which as the soul's work of art has human, pathognomic and physiognomic expression. Under the head of human expression are included, for example, the upright figure in general, and the formation of the limbs, especially the hand, as the absolute instrument, of the mouth laughter, weeping, etc., and the note of mentality diffused over the whole, which at once announces the body as the externality of a higher nature. This note is so slight, indefinite, and inexpressible a modification, because the figure in its externality is something immediate and natural, and can therefore only be an indefinite and quite imperfect sign for the mind, unable to represent it in its actual universality. Seen from the animal world, the human figure is the supreme phase in which mind makes an appearance. But for the mind it is only its first appearance, while language is its perfect expression. And the human figure, though the proximate phase of mind's existence, is at the same time in its physiognomic and pathognomic quality something contingent to it. To try to raise physiognomy and above all cranioscopy, phrenology, to the rank of sciences, was therefore one of the vainest fancies, still vainer than a signature rerum, which supposed the shape of a plant to afford indication of its medicinal virtue. 412 Implicitly the soul shows the untruth and unreality of matter, for the soul, in its concentrated self, cuts itself off from its immediate being, placing the latter over against it as a corporeity incapable of offering resistance to its molding influence. The soul, thus setting in opposition its being to its conscious self, absorbing it, and making it its own, has lost the meaning of mere soul, or the immediacy of mind. The actual soul, with its sensation and its concrete self-feeling turned into habit, has implicitly realized the ideality of its qualities. In this externality it has recollected and inwardized itself, and is infinite self-relation. This free universality thus made explicit shows the soul awaking to the higher stage of the ego, or abstract universality, insofar as it is for the abstract universality. In this way it gains the position of thinker and subject specially. A subject of the judgment in which the ego excludes from itself the sum total of its merely natural features as an object, a world external to it, but with such respect to that object that in it it is immediately reflected into. Philosophy of Mind. Section 1 Mind Subjective 17 Itself. Thus soul rises to become consciousness. 1 Naturliche Seele. 2 Naturliche Qualitäten. 3 Empfindung. 4 Die Fallende Seele. 5 Plato had a better idea of the relation of prophecy generally to the state of sober consciousness than many moderns, who supposed that the Platonic language on the subject of enthusiasm authorized their belief in the sublimity of the revelations of somnambulistic vision. Plato says, in the Timaeus, p. 71, the author of our being so ordered our inferior parts that they too might obtain a measure of truth, and in the liver placed their oracle, the power of divination by dreams. And herein is a proof that God has given the art of divination, not to the wisdom, but to the foolishness of man, for no man when in his wits attains prophetic truth and inspiration, but when he receives the inspired word, either his intelligence is enthralled by sleep, or he is demented by some distemper or possession, enthusiasm. Plato very correctly notes not merely the bodily conditions on which such visionary knowledge depends, and the possibility of the truth of the dreams, but also the inferiority of them to the reasonable frame of mind. 6 Selbstgefühl. 7 Gewohnheit. 8 Die wirkliche Seele. Subsection B Phenomenology of Mind, Consciousness. A. Consciousness proper. A. Sensuous consciousness. B. Sense perception. C. The intellect. B. Self-consciousness. A. Appetite. B. Self-consciousness recognitive. C. Universal self-consciousness. C. Reason. B. Phenomenology of Mind. Consciousness. 413 Consciousness constitutes the reflected or correlational grade of mind, the grade of mind as appearance. Ego is infinite self-relation of mind, but as subjective or as self-certainty. The immediate identity of the natural soul has been raised to this pure ideal self-identity, and what the former contained is, for this self-subsistent reflection set forth as an object. The pure abstract freedom of mind lets go from it its specific qualities the soul's natural life to an equal freedom as an independent object. It is of this latter, as external to it, that the ego is in the first instance aware, conscious, and as such it is consciousness. Ego, as this absolute negativity, is implicitly the identity in the otherness. The ego is itself that other and stretches over the object, as if that object were implicitly cancelled. It is one side of the relationship and the whole relationship the light, which manifests itself and something else too. Philosophy of Mind. Subsection B. Phenomenology of Mind, Consciousness 18. 414. The self-identity of the mind, thus first made explicit as the ego, is only its abstract formal ideality. As soul it was under the phase of substantial universality. Now, as subjective reflection in itself, it is referred to this substantiality as to its negative, something dark and beyond it. Hence consciousness, like reciprocal dependence in general, is the contradiction between the independence of the two sides and their identity in which they are merged into one. The mind as ego is essence, but since reality, in the sphere of essence, is represented as in immediate being and at the same time as ideal, it is as consciousness only the appearance, phenomenon, of mind. 415. As the ego is by itself only a formal identity, the dialectical movement of its intelligible unity, i.e. the successive steps in further specification of consciousness, does not, to it, seem to be its own activity, but is implicit, and to the ego it seems an alteration of the object. Consciousness consequently appears differently, modified according to the difference of the given object, and the gradual specification of consciousness appears as a variation in the characteristics of its objects. Ego, the subject of consciousness, is thinking. The logical process of modifying the object is what is identical in subject and object, their absolute interdependence, what makes the object the subject's own. The Kantian philosophy may be most accurately described as having viewed the mind as consciousness, and as containing the propositions only of a phenomenology, not of a philosophy of mind. The ego Kant regards as reference to something away and beyond, which in its abstract description is termed the thing in itself. And it is only from this finite point of view that he treats both intellect and will. Though in the notion of a power of reflective judgment he touches upon the idea of mind as subject objectivity, an intuitive intellect, etc., and even the idea of nature, still this idea is again deposed to an appearance, i.e. to a subjective maxim. 58. Reinhold may therefore be said to have correctly appreciated Kantism when he treated it as a theory of consciousness, under the name of faculty of ideation. Fit kept to the same point of view, his non-ego is only something set over against the ego, only defined as in consciousness, it is made no more than an infinite shock, i.e. a thing in itself. Both systems therefore have clearly not reached the intelligible unity or the mind as it actually and essentially is, but only as it is in reference to something else. As against Spinozism, again, it is to be noted that the mind in the judgment by which it constitutes itself an ego, a free subject contrasted with its qualitative affection, has emerged from substance, and that the philosophy, which gives this judgment as the absolute characteristic of mind, has emerged from Spinozism. 416. The aim of conscious mind is to make its appearance identical with its essence, to raise its self-certainty to truth. The existence of mind in the stage of consciousness is finite, because it is merely a nominal self-relation, or mere certainty. The object is only abstractly characterized as its, in other words, in the object it is only as an abstract ego that the mind is reflected into itself, hence its existence there has still a content, which is not as its own. 417. The grades of this elevation of certainty to truth are three in number. First, a. Consciousness in general, with an object set against it. B. Self-consciousness, for which ego is the object. C. Unity of consciousness and self-consciousness, where the mind sees itself embodied in the object and sees itself as implicitly and explicitly determinate, as reason, the notion of mind. A. Consciousness proper. 1. A. Sensuous consciousness. 418 Consciousness is, first, immediate consciousness, and its reference to the object accordingly the simple and underived certainty of it. The object similarly, being immediate, and existent, reflected in itself, is further characterized as immediately singular. This is sense consciousness. Philosophy of mind. Subsection B. Phenomenology of mind. Consciousness. 19 Consciousness as a case of correlation comprises only the categories belonging to the abstract ego or formal thinking, and these it treats as features of the object. 415. Sense consciousness therefore is aware of the object as an existent, a something, an existing thing, a singular, and so on. It appears as wealthiest in matter, but as poorest in thought. That wealth of matter is made out of sensations, they are the material of consciousness. 414. The substantial and qualitative, what the soul in its anthropological sphere is and finds in itself. This material the ego, the reflection of the soul in itself, separates from itself, and puts it first under the category of being. Spatial and temporal singularness, here and now, the terms by which in the Phenomenology of the Mind, Work 2, p. 73, I described the object of sense consciousness, strictly belongs to intuition. At present the object is at first to be viewed only in its correlation to consciousness, i.e. something external to it, and not yet as external on its own part, or as being beside and out of itself. 419 The sensible as somewhat becomes another, the reflection in itself of this somewhat, the thing, has many properties, and as a single thing, in its immediacy has several predicates. The muchness of the sense singular thus becomes a breadth of variety of relations, reflectional attributes, and universalities. These are logical terms introduced by the thinking principle, i.e. in this case by the ego, to describe the sensible. But the ego as itself apparent sees in all this characterization a change in the object, and sensuous consciousness, so construing the object, is sense perception. B. Sense perception, 2. 420. Consciousness, having passed beyond the sensible, wants to take the object in its truth, not as merely immediate, but as mediated, reflected in itself, and universal. Such an object is a combination of sense qualities with attributes of wider range by which thought defines concrete relations and connections. Hence, the identity of consciousness with the object passes from the abstract identity of I am sure to the definite identity of I know, and am aware. The particular grade of consciousness on which Kantism conceives the mind is perception, which is also the general point of view taken by ordinary consciousness, and more or less by the sciences. The sensuous certitudes of singular perceptions or observations form the starting point. These are supposed to be elevated to truth, by being regarded in their bearings, reflected upon, and on the lines of definite categories turned at the same time into something necessary and universal, viz. experiences. 421 This conjunction of individual and universal is admixture. The individual remains at the bottom hard and unaffected by the universal, to which, however, it is related. It is therefore a tissue of contradictions between the single things of sense or perception, which form the alleged ground of general experience, and the universality which has a higher claim to be the essence and ground between the individuality of a thing, which, taken in its concrete content, constitutes its independence, and the various properties which, free from this negative link and from one another, are independent universal matters. 123. This contradiction of the finite which runs through all forms of the logical spheres turns out most concrete, when the somewhat is defined as object. 194 sec. C. The intellect. 3. 422 The proximate truth of perception is that it is the object which is an appearance, and that the object's reflection in self is on the contrary a self-subsistent inward and universal. The consciousness of such an object is intellect. This inward, as we called it, of the thing is, on one hand, the suppression of the multiplicity of the sensible, and, in that manner, an abstract identity, on the other hand, however, it also for that reason contains the multiplicity, but as an interior simple difference, which remains self-identical in the vicissitudes of appearance. The simple difference is the realm of the laws of the phenomena, a copy of the phenomenon, but brought to rest and universality. Philosophy of Mind. Subsection B. Phenomenology of Mind, Consciousness 2423. The law, at first stating the mutual dependence of universal, permanent terms, has, insofar as its distinction is the inward one, its necessity on its own part, the one of the terms, as not externally different from the other, lies immediately in the other. But in this manner the interior distinction is, what it is in truth. The distinction on its own part, or the distinction which is none. With this new form characteristic, on the whole, consciousness implicitly vanishes, for consciousness as such implies the reciprocal independence of subject and object. The ego in its judgment has an object which is not distinct from it, it has itself. Consciousness has passed into self-consciousness. B. Self-consciousness, 4. 424. Self-consciousness is the truth of consciousness, the latter is a consequence of the former, or consciousness of another object being as a matter of fact also self-consciousness. The object is my idea, I am aware of the object as mine, and thus in it I am aware of me. The formula of self-consciousness is I equals I. Abstract freedom, pure ideality, and thus it lacks reality, for as it is its own object, there is strictly speaking no object, because there is no distinction between it and the object. 425. Abstract self-consciousness is the first negation of consciousness, and for that reason it is burdened with an external object, or, nominally, with the negation of it. Thus it is at the same time the antecedent stage. Consciousness, it is the contradiction of itself as self-consciousness and as consciousness. But the latter aspect and the negation in general is in I equals I potentially suppressed, and hence has this certitude of self against the object. It is the impulse to realize its implicit nature, by giving its abstract self-awareness content and objectivity, and in the other direction to free itself from its Sensuosen. SS, to set aside the given objectivity and identify it with itself. The two processes are one and the same, the identification of its consciousness and self-consciousness. A. Appetite or instinctive desire, 5. 426. Self-consciousness, in its immediacy, is a singular, and a desire, appetite, the contradiction implied in its abstraction which should yet be objective, or in its immediacy which has the shape of an external object and should be subjective. The certitude of oneself, which issues from the suppression of mere consciousness, pronounces the object null, and the outlook of self-consciousness towards the object equally qualifies the abstract ideality of such self-consciousness as null. 427. Self-consciousness, therefore, knows itself implicit in the object, which in this outlook is conformable to the appetite. In the negation of the two one-sided moments by the ego's own activity, this identity comes to be for the ego. To this activity the object, which implicitly and for self-consciousness is selfless, can make no resistance. The dialectic, implicit in it, towards self-suppression exists in this case as that activity of the ego. Thus while the given object is rendered subjective, the subjectivity divests itself of its one-sidedness and becomes objective to itself. 428. The product of this process is the fast conjunction of the ego with itself, its satisfaction realized, and itself made actual. On the external side it continues, in this ritu, Rn upon itself, primarily describable as an individual, and maintains itself as such, because its bearing upon the selfless object is purely negative, the latter, therefore, being merely consumed. Thus appetite in its satisfaction is always destructive, and in its content selfish, and as the satisfaction has only happened in the individual, and that is transient, the appetite is again generated in the very act of satisfaction. 429. But on the inner side, or implicitly, the sense of self which the ego gets in the satisfaction does not remain in abstract self-concentration or in mere individuality, on the contrary as negation of immediacy. And individuality the result involves a character of universality and of the identity of self-consciousness with its object. The judgment or dire-option of this self-consciousness is the consciousness of a free object, in philosophy of mind. Subsection B. Phenomenology of mind, consciousness 21, which ego is aware of itself as an ego, which however is also still outside it. B. Self-consciousness recognitive, 6. 430. Here there is a self-consciousness for a self-consciousness, at first immediately, as one of two things. For another. In that other as ego I behold myself, and yet also an immediately existing object, another ego. Absolutely independent of me and opposed to me. The suppression of the singleness of self-consciousness was only a first step in the suppression, and it merely led to the characterization of it as particular. This contradiction gives either self-consciousness the impulse to show itself as a free self, and to exist as such for the other, the process of recognition. 431. The process is a battle. I cannot be aware of me as myself in another individual, so long as I see in that other another and an immediate existence, and I am consequently bent upon the suppression of this immediacy of his. But in like measure I cannot be recognized as immediate, except so far as I overcome the mere immediacy on my own part, and thus give existence to my freedom. But this immediacy is at the same time the corporeity of self-consciousness, in which as in its sign and tool the latter has its own sense of self, and its being for others, and the means for entering into relation with them. 432. The fight of recognition is a life and death struggle, either self-consciousness imperils the other's life, and incurs a like peril for its own but only peril, for either is no less bent on maintaining his life, as the existence of his freedom. Thus the death of one, though by the abstract, therefore rude, negation of immediacy, it, from one point of view, solves the contradiction, is yet, from the essential point of view, i.e. the outward and visible recognition, a new contradiction, for that recognition is at the same time undone by the other's death, and a greater than the other. 433. But because life is as requisite as liberty to the solution, the fight ends in the first instance as a one-sided negation with inequality. While the one combatant prefers life, retains his single self-consciousness, but surrenders his claim for recognition, the other holds fast to his self-assertion and is recognized by the former as his superior. Thus arises the status of master and slave. In the battle for recognition and the subjugation under a master, we see, on their phenomenal side, the emergence of man's social life and the commencement of political union. Force, which is the basis of this phenomenon, is not on that account a basis of right, but only the necessary and legitimate factor in the passage from the state of self-consciousness sunk in appetite and selfish isolation into the state of universal self-consciousness. Force, then, is the external or phenomenal commencement of states, not their underlying and essential principle. 434. This status, in the first place, implies common wants and common concern for their satisfaction, for the means of mastery, the slave, must likewise be kept in life. In place of the rude destruction of the immediate object there ensues acquisition, preservation, and formation of it, as the instrumentality in which the two extremes of independence and non-independence are welded together. The form of universality thus arising in satisfying the want, creates a permanent means and a provision which takes care for and secures the future. 435. But secondly, when we look to the distinction of the two, the master beholds in the slave and his servitude the supremacy of his single selfhood resulting from the suppression of immediate selfhood, a suppression, however, which falls on another. This other, the slave, however, in the service of the master, works off his individualist self-will, overcomes the inner immediacy of appetite, and in this divestment of self and in the fear of his Lord makes the beginning of wisdom the passage to universal self. Consciousness. Philosophy of mind. Subsection B. Phenomenology of mind, consciousness 22, c. Universal self-consciousness. 436 Universal self-consciousness is the affirmative awareness of self in another self, each self as a free individuality has his own absolute independence, yet in virtue of the negation of its immediacy or appetite, without distinguishing itself from that other. Each is thus universal self-consciousness and objective, each has real universality in the shape of reciprocity, so far as each knows itself recognized in the other freeman, and is aware of this in so far as it recognizes the other and knows him to be free. This universal reappearance of self-consciousness, the notion which is aware of itself in its objectivity as a subjectivity identical with itself and for that reason universal, is the form of consciousness which lies at the root of all true mental or spiritual life in family, fatherland, state, and of all virtues, love, friendship, valor, honor, fame. But this appearer NCE of the underlying essence may also be severed from that essence, and be maintained apart in worthless honor, idle fame, etc. 437 This unity of consciousness and self-consciousness implies in the first instance the individuals mutually throwing light upon each other. But the difference between those who are thus identified is mere vague diversity, or rather it is a difference which is none. Hence its truth is the fully and really existent universality and objectivity of self-consciousness, which is reason. Reason, as the idea, 213, as it here appears, is to be taken as meaning that the distinction between notion and reality which it unifies has the special aspect of a distinction between the self-concentrated notion or consciousness, and the object subsisting external and opposed to it. See, Reason, 7. 438 The essential and actual truth which reason is, lies in the simple identity of the subjectivity of the notion with its objectivity and universality. The universality of reason, therefore, whilst it signifies that the object, which was only given in consciousness qua consciousness, is now itself universal, permeating and encompassing the ego, also signifies that the pure ego is the pure form which overlaps the object and encompasses it. 439 Self-consciousness, thus certified that its determinations are no less objective, or determinations of the very being of things, than they are its own thoughts, is reason, which as such an identity is not only the absolute substance, but the truth that knows it. For truth here has, as its peculiar mode and immanent form, the self-centered pure notion, ego, the certitude of self as infinite universality. Truth, aware of what it is mind, spirit. 1 das Bewusstsein als solches, a das Sinnliche Bewusstsein. 2 Wahrnehmung. 3 der Verstand. 4 Selbstbewusstsein. 5 die Begierde. 6 das Anerkennende Selbstbewusstsein. 7 die Vernunft. Philosophy of mind. Subsection B Phenomenology of mind, consciousness. 23 Subsection C Psychology, mind. A. Theoretical mind. A. Intuition. B. Representation. A. Recollection. B. Imagination. C. Memory. C. Thinking. B. Mind practical. A. Practical sense or feeling. B. The impulses and choice. C. Happiness. C. Free mind. C. Psychology. Mind. 1. 440 Mind has defined itself as the truth of soul and consciousness, the former a simple immediate totality, the latter now an infinite form which is not, like consciousness, restricted by that content, and does not stand in mere correlation to it as to its object, but is an awareness of this substantial totality, neither subjective nor objective. Mind, therefore, starts only from its own being and is in correlation only with its own features. Psychology accordingly studies the faculties or general modes of mental activity qua mental vision, ideation, remembering, etc., desires, etc. apart both from the content, which on the phenomenal side is found in empirical ideation, in thinking also and in desire and will, and from the two forms in which these modes exist, viz. in the soul as a physical mode, and in consciousness itself as a separately existent object of that consciousness. This, however, is not an arbitrary abstraction by the psychologist. Mind is just this. Elevation above nature and physical modes, and above the complication with an external object in one word, above the material, as its concept has just shown. All it has now to do is to realize this notion of its freedom, and get rid of the form of immediacy with which it once more begins. The content which is elevated to intuitions is its sensations, it is its intuitions also which are transmuted into representations, and its representations which are transmuted again into thoughts, etc. 441 The soul is finite, so far as its features are immediate or connatural. Consciousness is finite, in so far as it has an object. Mind is finite, in so far as, though it no longer has an object, it has a mode in its knowledge. I.e., it is finite by means of its immediacy, or, what is the same thing, by being subjective or only a notion. And it is a matter of no consequence, which is defined as its notion, and which has the reality of that notion. Say that its notion is the utterly infinite objective reason, then its reality is knowledge or intelligence. Say that knowledge is its notion, then its reality is that reason, and the realization of Kn. Knowledge consists in appropriating reason. Hence the finitude of mind is to be placed in the temporary failure of knowledge to get hold of the full reality of its reason, or, equally, in the temporary failure of reason to attain full manifestation in knowledge. Reason at the same time is only infinite so far as it is absolute freedom, so far, that is, as presupposing itself for its knowledge to work upon, it thereby reduces itself to finitude, and appears as everlasting movement of superseding this immediacy, of comprehending itself, and being a rational knowledge. 442 The progress of mind is development, in so far as its existent phase, viz. knowledge, involves as its intrinsic purpose and burden that utter and complete autonomy which is rationality, in which case the action of translating this purpose into reality is strictly only a nominal passage over into manifestation, and is even there a return into itself. So far as knowledge which has not shaken off its original quality of mere knowledge is only abstract or formal, the goal of mind is to give it objective fulfillment, and thus at the same time. Philosophy of mind. Subsection C Psychology, Mind 24 Produce its freedom. The development here meant is not that of the individual, which has a certain anthropological character, where faculties and forces are regarded as successively emerging and presenting themselves in external existence's series of steps, on the ascertainment of which there was for a long time great stress laid, by the system of Condillac, as if a conjectural natural emergence could exhibit the origin of these faculties and explain them. In Condillac's method there is an unmistakable intention to show how the several modes of mental activity could be made intelligible without losing sight of mental unity, and to exhibit their necessary interconnection. But the categories employed in doing so are of a wretched sort. Their ruling principle is that the sensible is taken, and with justice, as the prius or the initial basis, but that the latter phases that follow this starting point present themselves as emerging in a solely affirmative manner, and the negative aspect of mental activity, by which this material is transmuted into mind and destroyed as a sensible, is misconceived and overlooked. As the theory of Condillac states it, the sensible is not merely the empirical first, but is left as if it were the true and essential foundation. Similarly, if the activities of mind are treated as mere manifestations, forces, perhaps in terms stating their utility or suitability for some other interest of head or heart, there is no indication of the true final aim of the whole business. That can only be the intelligible unity of mind, and its activity can only have itself as aim. I.e., its aim can only be to get rid of the form of immediacy or subjectivity, to reach and get hold of itself, and to liberate itself to itself. In this way the so-called faculties of mind as thus distinguished are only to be treated as steps of this liberation. And this is the only rational mode of studying the mind and its various activities. 443 As consciousness has for its object the stage which preceded it, viz. the natural soul, 413, so mind has, or rather makes consciousness its object, i.e. whereas consciousness is only the virtual identity of the ego. With its other, 415, the mind realizes that identity as the concrete unity which it and it only knows. Its productions are governed by the principle of all reason that the contents are at once potentially existent, and are the mind's own, in freedom. Thus, if we consider the initial aspect of mind, that aspect is twofold as being and as its own. By the one, the mind finds in itself something which is, by the other it affirms it to be only its own. The way of mind is therefore a. To be theoretical, it has to do with the rational as its immediate affection which it must render its own, or it has to free knowledge from its presupposedness and therefore from its abstractness, and make the affection subjective. When the affection has been rendered its own, and the knowledge consequently characterized as free intelligence, i.e. as having its full and free characterization in itself, it is b. Will, practical mind, which in the first place is likewise formal, i.e. its content is at first only its own, and is immediately willed, and it proceeds next to liberate its volition from its subjectivity, which is the one-sided form of its contents, so that it c. confronts itself as free mind and thus gets rid of both its defects of one-sidedness. 444 The theoretical as well as the practical mind still fall under the general range of mind subjective. They are not to be distinguished as active and passive. Subjective mind is productive, but it is a merely nominal productivity. Inwards, the theoretical mind produces only its ideal world, and gains abstract autonomy. Within, while the practical, while it has to do with autonomous products, with a material which is its own, has a material which is only nominally such, and therefore a restricted content, for which it gains the form of universality. Outwards, the subjective mind, which has a unity of soul and consciousness, is thus also a reality. A reality at once anthropological and conformable to consciousness, has for its products, in the theoretical range, the word, and in the practical, not yet deed and action, but enjoyment. Philosophy of mind. Subsection C. Psychology. Mind 25 Psychology, like logic, is one of those sciences which in modern times have yet derived least profit from the more general mental culture and the deeper conception of reason. It is still extremely ill off. The turn which the Kantian philosophy has taken has given it greater importance, it has, and that in its empirical condition, been claimed as the basis of metaphysics, which is to consist of nothing but the empirical apprehension and the analysis of the facts of human consciousness, merely as facts, just as they are given. This position of psychology, mixing it up with forms belonging to the range of consciousness and with anthropology, has led to no improvement in its own condition, but it has had the further effect that, both for the mind as such, and for metaphysics and philosophy generally, all attempts have been abandoned to ascertain the necessity of essential and actual reality, to get at the notion and the truth. A. Theoretical mind. 445 Intelligence, 2, finds itself determined, this is its apparent aspect from which in its immediacy it starts. But as knowledge, intelligence consists in treating what is found as its own. Its activity has to do with the empty form, the pretense of finding reason, and its aim is to realize its concept or to be reason actual, along with which the content is realized as rational. This activity is cognition. The nominal knowledge, which is only certitude, elevates itself, as reason is concrete, to definite and conceptual knowledge. The course of this elevation is itself rational, and consists in a necessary passage, governed by the concept, of one grade or term of intelligent activity, a so-called faculty of mind, into another. The refutation which such cognition gives of the semblance that the rational is found, starts from the certitude or the faith of intelligence in its capability of rational knowledge, and in the possibility of being able to appropriate the reason, which it and the content virtually is. The distinction of intelligence from will is often incorrectly taken to mean that each has a fixed and separate existence of its own, as if volition could be without intelligence, or the activity of intelligence could be without will. The possibility of a culture of the intellect which leaves the heart untouched, as it is said, and of the heart without the intellect of hearts which in one-sided way want intellect, and heartless intellects, only proves at most that bad and radically untrue existences occur. But it is not philosophy which should take such untruths of existence and of mere imagining for truth, take the worthless for the essential nature. A host of other phrases used of intelligence, for example that it receives and accepts impressions from outside, that ideas arise through the causal operations of external things upon it, etc., belong to a point of view utterly alien to the mental level or to the position of philosophic study. A favorite reflectional form is that of powers and faculties of soul, intelligence, or mind. Faculty, like power or force, is the fixed quality of any object of thought, conceived as reflected into self. Force, 136, is no doubt the infinity of form of the inward and the outward, but its essential finitude involves the indifference of content to form, ib note. In this lies the want of organic unity which by this reflectional for rm, treating mind as a lot of forces, is brought into mind, as it is by the same method brought into nature. Any aspect which can be distinguished in mental action is stereotyped as an independent entity, and the mind thus made a skeleton-like mechanical collection. It makes absolutely no difference if we substitute the expression activities for powers and faculties. Isolate the activities and you similarly make the mind a mere aggregate, and treat their essential correlation as an external incident. The action of intelligence as theoretical mind has been called cognition, knowledge. Yet this does not mean intelligence inter alia knows, besides which it also intuits, conceives, remembers, imagines, etc. To take up such a position is in the first instance part and parcel of that isolating of mental activity just censured, but it is also in addition connected with the great question of modern times, as to whether true knowledge or the knowledge of truth is possible, which, if answered in the negative, must lead to abandoning the effort. The numerous aspects and reasons and modes of phrase with which external reflection swells the bulk of this question are cleared up in their place. The more external the attitude of understanding in the question, the more diffuse it makes its simple object. At the present place the simple concept of cognition is what confronts philosophy of mind. Subsection C, Psychology, Mind 26. The quite general assumption taken up by the question, viz. the assumption that the possibility of true knowledge in general is in dispute, and the assumption that it is possible for us at our will either to prosecute or to abandon cognition. The concept or possibility of cognition has come out as intelligence itself, as the certitude of reason. The act of cognition itself is therefore the actuality of intelligence. It follows from this that it is absurd to speak of intelligence and yet at the same time of the possibility or choice of knowing or not. But cognition is genuine, just so far as it realizes itself, or makes the concept its own. This nominal description has its concrete meaning exactly where cognition has it. The stages of its realizing activity are intuition, conception, memory, etc. These activities have no other immanent meaning, their aim is solely the concept of cognition. 445 note. If they are isolated, however, then an impression is implied that they are useful for something else than cognition, or that they severally procure a cognitive satisfaction of their own. And that leads to a glorification of the delights of intuition, remembrance, imagination. It is true that even as isolated, i.e. as non-intelligent, intuition, imagination, etc. can afford a certain satisfaction, what physical nature succeeds in doing by its fundamental quality, its out-of-selfness exhibiting the elements or factors of immanent reason external to each other that the intelligence can do by voluntary act, but the same result may happen where the intelligence is itself only natural and untrained. But the true satisfaction, it is admitted, is only afforded by an intuition permeated by intellect and mind, by rational conception, by products of imagination which are permeated by reason and exhibit ideas in a word, by cognitive intuition, cognitive conception, etc. The truth ascribed to such satisfaction lies in this, that intuition, conception, etc. are not isolated, and exist only as moments in the totality of cognition itself. A. Intuition, intelligent perception. 3. 446 The mind which as soul is physically conditioned, which as consciousness stands to this condition on the same terms as to an outward object, but which as intelligence finds itself so characterized is, 1. An inarticulate embryonic life, in which it is to itself as it were palpable and has the whole material of its knowledge. In consequence of the immediacy in which it is thus originally, it is in this stage only as an individual and possesses a vulgar subjectivity. It thus appears as mind in the guise of feeling. If feeling formerly turned up, 399, as a mode of the soul's existence, the finding of it or its immediacy was, in that case, essentially to be conceived as a congenital or corporeal condition, whereas at present it is only to be taken abstractly in the general sense of immediacy. 447 The characteristic form of feeling is that though it is a mode of some affection, his mode is simple. Hence feeling, even should its import be most sterling and true, has the form of casual particularity, not to mention that its import may also be the most scanty and most untrue. It is commonly enough assumed that mind has in its feeling the material of its ideas, but the statement is more usually understood in a sense the opposite of that which it has here. In contrast with the simplicity of feeling, it is usual rather to assume that the primary mental phase is judgment generally, or the distinction of consciousness into subject and object, and the special quality of sensation is derived from an independent object, external or internal. With us, in the truth of mind, the mere consciousness point of view, as opposed to true mental idealism, is swallowed up, and the matter of feeling has rather been supposed already as immanent in the mind. It is commonly taken for granted that as regards content there is more in feeling than in thought, this being specially affirmed of moral and religious feelings. Now the material, which the mind as it feels is to itself, is here the result and the mature result of a fully organized reason. Hence under the head of feeling is comprised all rational and indeed all spiritual content whatever. But the form of selfish singleness, to which feeling reduces the mind, is the lowest and worst vehicle it can have, one in which it is not found as a free and infinitely universal principle, but rather as subjective, nd private, in content and value entirely contingent. Trained and sterling feeling is the feeling of an educated mind which has acquired the consciousness of the true differences of things, of their essential relationships and real characters, and it is with such a mind that this rectified material enters into its feeling and receives this form. Feeling is the philosophy of mind. Subsection C. Psychology, Mind 27 Immediate, as it were the closest contact in which the thinking subject can stand to a given content. Against that content the subject reacts first of all with its particular self-feeling, which though it may be of more sterling value and of wider range than a one-sided intellectual standpoint, may just as likely be narrow and poor, and in any case is the form of the particular and subjective. If a man on any topic appeals not to the nature and notion of the thing, or at least to reasons to the generalities of common sense but to his feeling, the only thing to do is to let him alone, because by his behavior he refuses to have any lot or part in common rationality, and shuts himself up in his own isolated subjectivity, his private and particular self. 448. 2. As this immediate finding is broken up into elements, we have the one factor in attention, the abstract identical direction of mind, in feeling, as also in all other more advanced developments of it, an active self-collection, the factor of fixing it as our own, but with an as yet on why nominal autonomy of intelligence. Apart from such attention there is nothing for the mind. The other factor is to invest the special quality of feeling, as contrasted with this inwardness of mind, with the character of something existent, but as a negative or as the abstract otherness of itself. Intelligence thus defines the content of sensation as something that is out of itself, projects it into time and space, which are the forms in which it is intuitive. To the view of consciousness, the material is only an object of consciousness, a relative other. From mind it receives the rational characteristic of being its very other. 247, 254. 449, 3. When intelligence reaches a concrete unity of the two factors, that is to say, when it is at once self-collected in this externally existing material, and yet in this self-collectedness sunk in the out-of-selfness, it is intuition or mental vision. 450 At and towards this its own out-of-selfness, intelligence no less essentially directs its attention. In this its immediacy it is an awaking to itself, a recollection of itself. Thus intuition becomes a concretion of the material with the intelligence, which makes it its own, so that it no longer needs this immediacy, no longer needs to find the content. B. Representation, or mental idea. 451 Representation is this recollected or inwardized intuition, and as such is the middle between that stage of intelligence where it finds itself immediately subject to modification and that where intelligence is in its freedom, or, as thought. The representation is the property of intelligence, with a preponderating subjectivity. However, as its right of property is still conditioned by contrast with the immediacy, and the representation cannot as it stands be said to be. The path of intelligence in representations is to render the immediacy inward, to invest itself with intuitive action in itself, and at the same time to get rid of the subjectivity of the inwardness, and inwardly divest itself of it, so as to be in itself in an externality of its own. But as representation begins from intuition and the ready-found material of intuition, the intuitional contrast still continues to affect its activity, and makes its concrete products still syntheses, which do not grow to the concrete immanence of the notion till they reach the stage of thought. Recollection. 5. 452 Intelligence, as it at first recollects the intuition, places the content of feeling in its own inwardness in a space and a time of its own. In this way that content is, 1. An image or picture, liberated from its original immediacy and abstract singleness amongst other things, and received into the universality of the ego. The image loses the full complement of features proper to intuition, and is arbitrary or contingent, isolated, we may say, from the external place, time, and immediate context in which the intuition stood. 453, 2. The image is of itself transient, and intelligence itself is as attention its time and also its place, its when and where. But intelligence is not only consciousness and actual existence, but qua intelligence is the subject and the potentiality of its own specializations. The image when thus kept in mind is no longer philosophy of mind. Subsection C. Psychology, Mind 28. Existent, but stored up out of consciousness. To grasp intelligence as this night-like mine or pit in which is stored a world of infinitely many images and representations, yet without being in consciousness, is from the one point of view the universal postulate, which bids us treat the notion as concrete, in the way we treat, for example, the germ as affirmatively containing, in virtual possibility, all the qualities that come into existence in the subsequent development of the tree. Inability to grasp a universal like this, which, though intrinsically concrete, still continues simple, is what has led people to talk about special fibers and areas as receptacles of particular ideas. It was felt that what was diverse should in the nature of things have a local habitation peculiar to itself. But whereas the reversion of the germ from its existing specializations to its simplicity in a purely potential existence takes place only in another germ, the germ of the fruit, intelligence qua intelligence shows the potential coming to free existence in its development, and yet at the same time collecting itself in its inwardness. Hence from the other point of view intelligence is to be conceived as this subconscious mind, i.e. as the existent universal in which the different has not yet been realized in its separations. And it is indeed this potentiality which is the first form of universality offered in mental representation. 454. 3. An image thus abstractly treasured up needs, if it is to exist, an actual intuition, and what is strictly called remembrance is the reference of the image to an intuition, and that as a subsumption of the immediate single intuition, impression, under what is in point of form universal, under the representation idea, with the same content. Thus intelligence recognizes the specific sensation and the intuition of it as what is already its own in them. It is still within itself, at the same time it is aware that what is only its primarily internal image is also an immediate object of intuition, by which it is authenticated. The image, which in the mind of intelligence was only its property, now that it has been endued with externality, comes actually into its possession. And so the image is at once rendered distinguishable from the intuition and separable from the blank night in which it was originally submerged. Intelligence is thus the force which can give forth its property, and dispense with external intuition for its existence in it. This synthesis of the internal image with the recollected existence is representation proper. By this synthesis the internal now has the qualification of being able to be presented before intelligence and to have its existence in it. BB. Imagination. 6. 455. 1. The intelligence which is active in this possession is the reproductive imagination, where the images issue from the inward world belonging to the ego, which is now the power over them. The images are, in the first instance, referred to this external, immediate time and space which is treasured up along with them. But it is solely in the conscious subject, where it is treasured up, that the image has the individuality in which the features composing it are conjoined, whereas their original concretion, i.e. at first only in space and time, as a unit of intuition, has been broken up. The content reproduced, belonging as it does to the self-identical unity of intelligence, and an output from its universal mind, has a general idea, representation, to supply the link of association for the images which according to circumstances are more abstract or more concrete ideas. The so-called laws of the association of ideas were objects of great interest, especially during that outburst of empirical psychology which was contemporaneous with the decline of philosophy. In the first place, it is not ideas, properly so called, which are associated. Secondly, these modes of relation are not laws, just for the reason that there are so many laws about the same thing, as to suggest a caprice and a contingency opposed to the very nature of law. It is a matter of chance whether the link of association is something pictorial, or an intellectual category, such as likeness and contrast, reason and consequence. The train of images and representations suggested by association is the sport of vacant-minded ideation, where, though intelligence shows itself by a certain formal universe ality, the matter is entirely pictorial. Image and idea, if we leave out of account the more precise definition of those forms given above, present also a distinction in content. The former is the more sensuously concrete idea, whereas the idea, representation, whatever be its content, from image, notion, or idea, has always the peculiarity, though belonging to intelligence, of being in respect of its philosophy of mind. Subsection C. Psychology, Mind 29. Content given and immediate. It is still true of this idea or representation, as of all intelligence, that it finds its material, as a matter of fact, to be so, and the universality which the aforesaid material receives by ideation is still abstract. Mental representation is the mean in the syllogism of the elevation of intelligence. The link between the two significations of self-relatedness, viz. being and universality, which in consciousness receive the title of object and subject. Intelligence complements what is merely found by the attribution of universality, and the internal and its own by the attribution of being, but a being of its own institution. On the distinction of representations and thoughts, see Introduction to the Logic, 20. Note. Abstraction, which occurs in the ideational activity by which general ideas are produced, and ideas qua ideas virtually have the form of generality, is frequently explained as the incidence of many similar images one upon another, and is supposed to be thus made intelligible. If this superimposing is to be no mere accident and without principle, a force of attraction in like images must be assumed, or something of the sort, which at the same time would have the negative power of rubbing off the dissimilar elements against each other. This force is really intelligence itself, the self-identical ego, which by its internalizing recollection gives the images ipso facto generality, and subsumes the single intuition under the already internalized image. 453. 456. Thus even the association of ideas is to be treated as a subsumption of the individual under the universal, which forms their connecting link. But here intelligence is more than merely a general form, its inwardness is an internally definite, concrete subjectivity with a substance and value of its own, derived from some interest, some latent concept or ideal principle, so far as we may by anticipation speak of such. Intelligence is the power which wields the stores of images and ideas belonging to it, and which thus, too, freely combines and subsumes these stores in obedience to its peculiar tenor. Such is creative imagination. 7. Symbolic, allegoric, or poetical imagination, where the intelligence gets a definite embodiment in this store of ideas and informs them with its general tone. These more or less concrete, individualized creations are still syntheses, for the material, in which the subjective principles and ideas get a mentally pictorial existence, is derived from the data of intuition. 457. In creative imagination, intelligence has been so far perfected as to need no aids for intuition. Its self-sprung ideas have pictorial existence. This pictorial creation of its intuitive spontaneity is subjective, still lacks the side of existence. But as the creation unites the internal idea with the vehicle of materialization, intelligence has therein implicitly returned both to identical self-relation and to immediacy. As reason, its first start was to appropriate the immediate datum in itself, 445, 435, i.e. to universalize it, and now its action as reason, 438, is from the present point directed towards giving the character of an existent to what in it has been perfected to concrete auto-intuition. In other words, it aims at making itself be and be a fact. Acting on this view, it is self-uttering, intuition producing, the imagination which creates signs. Productive imagination is the center in which the universal and being, one's own and what is picked up, internal and external, are completely welded into one. The preceding syntheses of intuition, recollection, etc., are unifications of the same factors, but they are syntheses. It is not till creative imagination that intelligence ceases to be the vague mine and the universal, and becomes an individuality, a concrete subjectivity, in which the self-reference is defined both to being and to universality. The creations of imagination are on L hands recognized as such combinations of the mind's own and inward with the matter of intuition. What further and more definite aspects they have is a matter for other departments. For the present, this internal studio of intelligence is only to be looked at in these abstract aspects. Imagination, when regarded as the agency of this unification, is reason, but only a nominal reason, because the matter or theme it embodies is to imagination qua imagination a matter of indifference, whilst reason qua reason also insists upon the truth of its content. Another point calling for special notice is that, when imagination elevates the internal meaning to an image and intuition, and this is expressed by saying that it gives the former the character of an existent, the phrase must not seem surprising that intelligence makes itself be as a thing, for its ideal import is itself, and so is the philosophy of mind. Subsection C. Psychology, Mind 30 aspect which it imposes upon it. The image produced by imagination of an object is a bare mental or subjective intuition. In the sign or symbol it adds intuitability proper, and in mechanical memory it completes, so far as it is concerned, this form of being. 458. In this unity, initiated by intelligence, of an independent representation with an intuition, the matter of the latter is, in the first instance, something accepted, somewhat immediate or given, for example, the color of the cockade, etc. But in the fusion of two elements, the intuition does not count positively or as representing itself, but as representative of something else. It is an image, which has received as its soul and meaning an independent mental representation. This intuition is the sign. The sign is some immediate intuition, representing a totally different import from what naturally belongs to it. It is the pyramid into which a foreign soul has been conveyed, and where it is conserved. The sign is different from the symbol, for in the symbol the original characters, in essence and conception, of the visible object are more or less identical with the import which it bears as symbol, whereas in the sign, strictly so-called, the natural attributes of the intuition, and the connotation of which it is a sign, have nothing to do with each other. Intelligence therefore gives proof of wider choice and ampler authority in the use of intuitions when it treats them as designatory, significative, rather than as symbolical. In logic and psychology, signs and language are usually foisted in somewhere as an appendix, without any trouble being taken to display their necessity and systematic place in the economy of intelligence. The right place for the sign is that just given, where intelligence which as intuiting generates the form of time and space, but appears as recipient of sensible matter, out of which it forms ideas, now gives its own original ideas a definite existence from itself, treating the intuition or time and space as filled full, as its own property, deleting the connotation which properly and naturally belongs to it, and conferring on it another connotation as its soul and import. This sign-creating activity may be distinctively named productive memory, the primarily abstract mnemosign, since memory, which in ordinary life is often used as interchangeable and synonymous with remembrance, recollection, and even with conception and imagination, has always to do with signs only. 459. The intuition in its natural phase as something given and given in space acquires, when employed as a sign, the peculiar characteristic of existing only as superseded and sublimated. Such is the negativity of intelligence, and thus the true phase of the intuition used as a sign is existence in time, but its existence vanishes in the moment of being, and if we consider the rest of its external psychical quality, its institution by intelligence, but an institution growing out of its anthropological own naturalness. This institution of the natural is the vocal note, where the inward idea manifests itself in adequate utterance. The vocal note which receives further articulation to express specific ideas, speech and its system, language, gives to sensations, intuitions, conceptions, a second and higher existence than they naturally possess, invests them with the right of existence in the ideational realm. Language here comes under discussion only in the spec-ial aspect of a product of intelligence for manifesting its ideas in an external medium. If language had to be treated in its concrete nature, it would be necessary for its vocabulary or material part to recall the anthropological or psychophysiological point of view, 401, and for the grammar or formal portion to anticipate the standpoint of analytic understanding. With regard to the elementary material of language, while on one hand the theory of mere accident has disappeared, on the other, the principle of imitation has been restricted to the slight range it actually covers, that of vocal objects. Yet, one may still hear the German language praised for its wealth, that wealth consisting in its special expression for special sounds, Rauschen, Sozen, Narin, etc. There have been collected more than 100 such words. Perhaps the humor of the moment creates fresh ones when it pleases. Such superabundance in the realm of sense and of triviality contributes nothing to form the real wealth of a cultivated language. The strictly raw material of language itself depends more upon an inward symbolism than a symbolism referring to external objects. It depends, i.e., on anthropological articulation, as it were the philosophy of mind. Subsection C. Psychology, Mind 31. Posture in the corporeal act of oral utterance. For each vowel and consonant accordingly, as well as for their more abstract elements, the posture of lips, palate, tongue in each, and for their combinations, people have tried to find the appropriate signification. But these dull subconscious beginnings are deprived of their original importance and prominence by new influences, it may be by external agencies or by the needs of civilization. Having been originally sensuous intuitions, they are reduced to signs, and thus have only traces left of their original meaning, if it be not altogether extinguished. As to the formal element, again, it is the work of analytic intellect which informs language with its categories, it is this logical instinct which gives rise to grammar. The study of language is still in their original state, which we have first really begun to make acquaintance with in modern times, has shown on this point that they contain a very elaborate grammar and express distinctions which are lost or have been largely obliterated in the languages of more civilized nations. It seems as if the language of the most civilized nations has the most imperfect grammar, and that the same language has a more perfect grammar when the nation is in a more uncivilized state than when it reaches a higher civilization. Compare W. von Humboldt's essay on the dual. In speaking of vocal, which is the original language, we may touch, only in passing, upon written languages. Further development in the particular sphere of language which borrows the help of an externally practical activity. It is from the province of immediate spatial intuition to which written language proceeds that it takes and produces the signs. 454. In particular, hieroglyphics uses spatial figures to designate ideas. Alphabetical writing, on the other hand, uses them to designate vocal notes which are already signs. Alphabetical writing thus consists of signs, the words or concrete signs of vocal language being analyzed into their simple elements, which severally receive designation. Leibniz's practical mind misled him to exaggerate the advantages which a complete written language, formed on the hieroglyphic method. And hieroglyphics are used even where there is alphabetic writing, as in our signs for the numbers, the planets, the chemical elements, etc., would have as a universal language for the intercourse of nations and especially of scholars. But we may be sure that it was rather the intercourse of nations, as was probably the case in Phoenicia, and still takes place in Canton C. Macartney's Travels by Staunton, which occasioned the need of alphabetical writing and led to its formation. At any rate, a comprehensive hieroglyphic language, forever completed, is impracticable. Sensible objects no doubt admit of permanent signs, but, as regards signs for mental objects, the progress of thought and the continual development of logic lead to changes in the views of their internal relations and thus also of their nature, and this would involve the rise of a new hieroglyphical denotation. Even in the case of sense objects it happens that their names, i.e. their signs in vocal language, are frequently changed, as, for example, in chemistry and mineralogy. Now that it has been forgotten what names properly are, viz. externalities which of themselves have no sense, and only get signification as signs, and now that, instead of names proper, people ask for terms expressing a sort of definition, which is frequently changed capriciously and fortuitously, the denomination, i.e. the composite name formed of signs of their generic characters or other supposed characteristic properties, is altered in accordance with the differences of view with regard to the genus or other supposed specific property. It is only a stationary civilization, like the Chinese, which admits of the hieroglyphic language of that nation, and its method of writing moreover can only be the lot of that small part of a nation which is in exclusive possession of mental culture. The progress of the vocal language depends most closely on the habit of alphabetical writing, by means of which only does vocal language acquire the precision and purity of its articulation. The imperfection of the Chinese vocal language is notorious. Numbers of its words possess several utterly different meanings, as many as 10 and 20, so that, in speaking, the distinction is made perceptible merely by accent and intensity, by speaking low and soft or crying out. The European, learning to speak Chinese, falls into the most ridiculous blunders before he has mastered these absurd refinements of accentuation. Perfection here consists in the opposite of that parlor song accent which in Europe is justly required of an educated speaker. The hieroglyphic mode of writing keeps the Chinese vocal language from reaching that objective precision which is gained in articulation by alphabetic writing. Alphabetic writing is on all accounts the more intelligent, in it the word the mode, peculiar to the intellect, of uttering its ideas most worthily is brought to consciousness and made an object of reflection. Engaging. Philosophy of mind. Subsection C. Psychology, Mind 32. The attention of intelligence, as it does, it is analyzed, the work of sign-making is reduced to its few simple elements, the primary postures of articulation, in which the sense factor in speech is brought to the form of universality, at the same time that in this elementary phase it acquires complete precision and purity. Thus, alphabetic writing retains at the same time the advantage of vocal language, that the ideas have names strictly so called. The name is the simple sign for the exact idea, i.e. the simple plain idea, not decomposed into its features and compounded out of them. Hieroglyphics, instead of springing from the direct analysis of sensible signs, like alphabetic writing, arise from an antecedent analysis of ideas. Thus a theory readily arises that all ideas may be reduced to their elements, or simple logical terms, so that from the elementa are signs chosen to express these, as, in the case of the Chinese Kua, the simple straight stroke, and the stroke broken into two parts. A hieroglyphic system would be generated by their composition. This feature of hieroglyphic, the analytical designations of ideas which misled Leibniz to regard it as preferable to alphabetic writing, is rather in antagonism with the fundamental desideratum of language. The name. To want a name means that, for the immediate idea, which, however ample a connotation it may include, is still for the mind simple in the name, we require a simple immediate sign which for its own sake does not suggest anything, and has for its sole function to signify and represent sensibly the simple idea as such. It is not merely the image-loving and image-limited intelligence that lingers over the simplicity of ideas and reintegrates them from the more abstract factors into which they have been analyzed. Thought too reduces to the form of a simple thought the concrete connotation which it resumes and reunites from the mere aggregate of attributes to which analysis has reduced it. Both alike require such signs, simple in respect of their meaning, signs, which though consisting of several letters or syllables and even decomposed into such, yet do not exhibit a combination of several ideas. What has been stated is the principle for settling the value of these written languages. It also follows that in hieroglyphics the relations of concrete mental ideas to one another must necessarily be tangled and perplexed, and that the analysis of these, and the proximate results of such analysis must again be analyzed, appears to be possible in the most various and divergent ways. Every divergence in analysis would give rise to another formation of the written name, just as in modern times, as already noted.